The morning Harlan Briggs rode up to Cordelia Wexford's gate, he wasn't there to buy cattle. He was there to collect a debt she didn't owe. He pulled his horse sideways across the road so her ranch hand couldn't pass, reached into his coat and unfolded a document thick enough to choke on. "Tell to your mistress," he said to the young hand, loud enough for 3 neighbors to hear, "that she has 30 days to vacate the northern pasture, or I'll have the sheriff drag her off it." He smiled when he said it. That was the part that made people remember. Not the threat. The smile. Cordelia Wexford had buried 2 husbands, survived 2 winters that killed stronger people, and built one of the most productive ranches in Red Willow County without asking a single man for permission. And Harlan Briggs had just told her neighbors she was sitting on land that wasn't hers. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where ordinary people refuse to be small, please subscribe to our channel right now. Hit the like button, leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We read every single one, and we love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't go anywhere. This one is just getting started. The document Harlan Briggs had waved at her gate was dated 3 weeks earlier, filed at the Red Willow County Clerk's office on a Tuesday afternoon when the regular clerk was out sick and his 19-year-old nephew was covering the desk. The filing claimed that a strip of Cordelia's northern pasture, roughly 400 acres of the best grazing land she owned, had originally been deeded to a man named Orville Pratt in 1871, and that Harlan Briggs had purchased that deed from Pratt's estate the previous summer. Cordelia found out about it the way she found out about most things in Red Willow, not from a lawyer, not from the county office. From her housekeeper, May Driscoll, who had heard it from the butcher's wife, who had heard it directly from Harlan Briggs himself while he was buying a pork loin, and apparently felt no need to be quiet about his plans. May set a cup of coffee on the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a moment. "You need to sit down," she finally said. Cordelia was already sitting. She had been sitting at that kitchen table since 5 in the morning, going over feed costs and a fencing estimate she'd been putting off since September. She looked up from the papers. May's face told her the rest before the words did. "Harlan Briggs filed a land claim against your north pasture." Cordelia set her pencil down. "On what grounds?" "Says he bought a deed from some estate. Old deed. Before your first husband acquired the property." Cordelia was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear her ranch hand Denny moving a water trough near the barn, the scrape of metal on frozen ground carrying clearly in the cold November air. "Which estate?" she said. "Man named Pratt. Orville Pratt has been dead for 11 years. I know. His property was sold at auction. I know who bought it. It wasn't Harlan Briggs." May sat down across from her. "Cordelia, he's already talked to 4 people in town. He's not being quiet about this." "Of course he isn't." That was the thing about Harlan Briggs that most people in Red Willow had learned to navigate around rather than confront directly. He was not the kind of man who ambushed you. He was the kind who announced his intentions loudly, in public, in front of witnesses, so that by the time you understood what was happening, half the town had already formed an opinion about it. He was a land broker and occasional creditor who had expanded his holdings 3 times in the past decade, always through paperwork rather than labor, always through deals that looked legal, until you tried to look too closely at them. He had approached Cordelia twice before about purchasing the north pasture outright. Both times she had declined without elaborating, which she suspected had irritated him more than a direct argument would have. She finished her coffee. Then she put on her coat. "Where are you going?" May asked. "To look at my deed box." The deed box was in the top of her bedroom closet, behind 2 wool blankets and a broken lamp she kept meaning to repair. She pulled it down, set it on the bed, and went through every document inside. Her original property deed, the survey from 1879, the transfer document from when she'd acquired the eastern section 4 years later, the grazing rights on the creek boundary. She read every page. Then she read them again. Then she put on her hat and rode into Red Willow. The county clerk's office was on the 2nd floor of a building that also housed a dentist and a notary, and it smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and old paper. The regular clerk, a precise man named Gordon Albright, looked up when she walked in and had the good sense not to pretend he didn't know why she was there. "Mrs. Wexford. Gordon, I imagine you've heard. Show me the filing." He hesitated just long enough to tell her he'd been expecting this visit and hadn't been looking forward to it. Then he pulled a folder from the cabinet behind his desk and laid it on the counter. Cordelia read it standing up. She read it twice. The document was typed rather than handwritten, which was unusual for a deed that old. The notary stamp in the lower corner was from a county 200 miles east. The signature of the original grantor was thin and slightly irregular, the kind of signature that looked like someone had copied it from something, rather than written it from memory. "When was this filed?" she said. 3 weeks ago Tuesday. Your nephew was covering that day." Gordon cleared his throat. "He was, yes." "Did he examine the provenance of this deed before accepting it?" A pause. "He's 19. That's not an answer." "No," Gordon said quietly. "I don't believe he examined it carefully." Cordelia straightened up. "I want a copy of everything in that folder. Every page, including the filing stamp. I can have that ready this afternoon. I'll wait." She sat in the wooden chair against the wall while Gordon made copies at his desk. 2 other people came in and out. During that time, a farmer filing a water rights renewal and a woman picking up a marriage license, and both of them glanced at Cordelia with the particular expression people wear when they know something is wrong, but haven't decided yet whether to acknowledge it. She didn't look back at either of them. When Gordon handed her the copies, he held onto the folder a half-second longer than necessary. "Mrs. Wexford, for whatever it's worth, I've worked with your land records for 12 years. I don't recognize that deed." She looked at him. "I'm not saying that officially," he added. "I know," she said. "Thank you, Gordon." She rode home with the copies inside her coat. That night, after May had gone home and the ranch was quiet, Cordelia spread everything across the kitchen table, her own documents on the left, the copies of Briggs's filing on the right, and went through them side by side. The more she read, the clearer it became, and the clearer it became, the colder she felt. Because the filing wasn't a clumsy forgery. It was a careful one. Someone had done research. Someone had located a real name, a real death, a real gap in the public record long enough ago that the witnesses were either dead or gone, and had built something around that gap that would be difficult to disprove quickly. This was not something Harlan Briggs had put together in a week. This had taken time. She was still at the table at midnight when she heard a wagon on her road. That was unusual. It was a Tuesday. Nothing came up her road on Tuesdays. She went to the window and looked out. There was no moon worth speaking of, but she could make out the shape of a wagon stopped outside her gate, and a man climbing down from the seat. He moved without urgency, which was either a good sign or wasn't. Then she heard a smaller set of footsteps drop from the wagon after him. A child. She pulled on her coat and went out to the porch. "Who's there?" "Ephraim Lockridge." The voice was level, not apologetic. "I've got a load of pine. Thought you might be running low." Cordelia looked at the wagon. It was, in fact, stacked with split firewood. The man standing beside it was somewhere around her own age, lean in the way people get when they've worked hard for a long time, with a hat that had seen too many seasons and a coat that wasn't quite warm enough for November. Beside him stood a boy of about 9, clutching a single piece of split pine against his chest with both arms. "It's late," she said. "We were already on the road," Ephraim said. "Didn't seem right to pass by. I didn't place an order for wood." "No, ma'am." She looked at the boy. "What's your name?" "Tobin," the boy said. Then after a moment, "Lockridge. Is that your piece of wood?" "Yes, ma'am." "What are you planning to do with it?" "Bring it to you," he said. "If that's all right." She stood on the porch looking at them for a moment, this man she didn't know, and his son, and their wagon load of pine at nearly midnight, and she was tired enough and rattled enough from the day's events that her usual caution had worn down past its usual operating level. "Come around to the side door," she said. "I'll show you where to stack it." She didn't know it then. She wouldn't have believed it if someone had told her. But that was the moment everything began to change. Ephraim Lockridge had moved to Red Willow 3 months earlier from a county to the south, where he'd been running a modest cattle operation until a combination of drought and a bad loan had reduced it to something that wasn't worth staying for. He'd bought a small acreage on the western edge of Red Willow County, decent land, nothing spectacular, and was in the process of rebuilding from a position that most men would have found discouraging enough to give up on. He wasn't most men, or at least that was how it looked from the outside. On the inside, he'd had plenty of moments that year that looked a lot like giving up. Except that Tobin was always there when he had them, and a man doesn't give up when there's a 9-year-old watching. That night, after they'd stacked the wood along the side wall of Cordelia's house, and she'd offered them hot coffee before the ride back, Tobin sat at her kitchen table and drank his coffee with both hands around the cup and looked at the document spread across the table with the frank curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend he isn't looking at things. "What are all those papers?" he said. "Tobin," Ephraim said. "It's all right," Cordelia said. "Paperwork, land business. Is somebody trying to take your land?" She looked at the boy. 9 years old. His father made a short, uncomfortable sound. "Something like that," she said. Tobin considered this with the serious expression of someone who understood, at least in a general way, what it meant when someone tried to take something that belonged to you. "My dad says the answer to bad paperwork is better paperwork," he said. Cordelia looked at Ephraim. Ephraim looked at his coffee cup. "He doesn't have a filter." "No," Cordelia agreed. "But he's not wrong." They left within the hour, and she stood on the porch until the wagon disappeared down the road. Then she went back inside, sat down at the table, and picked up the copies of Harlan Briggs's filing again. Better paperwork. She was going to need a lawyer. And not a Red Willow lawyer. Red Willow had two, and both of them had done work for Harlan Briggs at one point or another. She was going to need someone from outside the county who didn't owe Briggs anything and wasn't afraid of him. She wrote a letter that night to an attorney in Helena she'd read about in a county newspaper 6 months ago, a woman named Harriet Voss, who specialized in land disputes and had, according to the article, recently won a case against a mining company that had been considered unwinnable by 3 other firms. Cordelia wasn't sure Harriet Voss would take her case. She wasn't even sure Harriet Voss was still in Helena. But she wrote the letter anyway, because doing something was better than sitting still, and because a boy she'd just met had told her the answer to bad paperwork was better paperwork, and because sometimes the simplest things are true. She sealed the envelope. She set it by the door to go out first thing in the morning. Then she went back to the table and kept reading. She was still reading at 2 in the morning when she found the first real problem. The deed in Harlan Briggs's filing referenced a survey line, a specific survey line from 1869, before Montana was even a proper territory in the sense that mattered legally. The survey line was described with coordinates and markers, and when she compared those coordinates to her own survey from 1879, they overlapped, but not perfectly. There was a discrepancy of about 60 feet at the eastern boundary. 60 feet on a 400-acre parcel wasn't nothing. But it wasn't the point. The point was that whoever had constructed this forgery had used a real survey line as the anchor, which meant that if Briggs's attorney argued the 60-foot discrepancy was a surveying error in the 1879 document rather than the 1869 one, the burden of proof would shift. It would become a question of which survey was more reliable. And older didn't automatically mean wrong. She closed her eyes. This was not going to be simple. She had known that from the moment May sat down across from her this morning. But the specific shape of the difficulty was becoming clear now, and it was worse than she'd hoped and not quite as bad as she'd feared, which was the narrowest range of outcomes she felt she could work with. She opened her eyes. She picked up her pencil. She started making notes. The following Saturday morning, Ephraim and Tobin came back. Not at midnight this time. Mid-morning, with another wagon of pine, and Tobin was already talking before he climbed down from the seat. "We brought the split pieces this time," he announced. "They're better for starting fires. The big rounds are harder to get going, especially if the wood is still got any moisture. Dad says most people don't season wood long enough, and that's why they have trouble." Cordelia came down from the porch. "Does your father know you're giving away his firewood advice?" "He doesn't mind," Tobin said. "He says good information should be shared." She looked at Ephraim, who was climbing down from the other side of the wagon, with the expression of a man who had accepted that his son would say whatever was in his head, and the only productive response was to let it happen. "You didn't need to come back," she said. "We had another load worth bringing," Ephraim said. "And Tobin wanted to know how your paperwork situation turned out." Did he, his words. She looked at Tobin, who had already picked up 2 pieces of wood and was carrying them toward the side of the house with the air of someone with a specific destination in mind. "I wrote to a lawyer in Helena," she told Ephraim. "I haven't heard back yet." "Helena's a good idea," he said. "Local lawyers here have too many other loyalties." She studied him for a moment. "You know about Harlan Briggs." "It wasn't a question exactly." "Enough," Ephraim said. "He came by my place last month. Said he might be interested in buying my acreage if I found myself in the position of needing to sell." He paused. Said it in that particular way that suggests he expects you to be in that position sooner rather than later. Cordelia felt something go cold and still inside her chest. He approached you. He did. And I told him I didn't plan to sell, and he smiled and said change, and that was the end of it. Ephraim picked up an armful of wood. Didn't think much of it at the time. Thought more of it when I heard about what he filed against you. She watched him carry the wood toward the house. Why are you telling me this? He stopped, turned back to look at her. He had the kind of face that was honest in the way that some faces just are not because the person was without complexity, but because whatever he was thinking had a tendency to show up in his expression, whether he'd given it permission or not. Because you should know who you're dealing with, he said. And because you struck me as someone who can use information and doesn't particularly need it softened. She held his gaze for a moment. Stack it along the east wall, she said. There's more room there. He nodded and kept moving. By the time they'd unloaded the wagon, Tobin had established himself in the kitchen with the unerring instinct of a child for the warmest room in a house. And May, who had come in that morning to do some mending, had given him a piece of cornbread and was listening to him explain, in considerable detail, the temperamental qualities of a pony he was trying to train. Ephraim stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at his son with an expression that was difficult to name. It wasn't just fondness. It was something tireder and more complicated than that the look of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and occasionally, in moments like this one, sets it down without entirely meaning to. Cordelia came to stand beside him. How long has it been just the two of you, she said. 4 years. That's a long time. Yes, he said. It is. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Tobin was telling May about the pony's objection to puddles, acting it out with gestures that made May laugh, and the kitchen was warm, and the smell of cornbread and wood smoke was filling the house in the particular way that a house smells when there are people in it who are comfortable with each other. Cordelia had almost forgotten what that smelled like. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Helena. Harriet Voss wrote in a hand that was small and precise and covered both sides of 2 pages. She had reviewed the situation as Cordelia had described it. She had, in fact, already encountered Harlan Briggs's name in connection with a land dispute in a neighboring county 2 years prior, though that matter had been settled before it reached a court. She had opinions about the nature of the filing that she preferred to share in person rather than in a letter. She could be in Red Willow by the following Thursday if Cordelia could arrange a meeting space where they could spread documents without being observed. She signed it, H. Voss, attorney at law. No pleasantries at the top, no closing sentiment at the bottom. Just information and a question about logistics. Cordelia read it twice. Then she wrote back the same afternoon, Thursday. My kitchen table. Come around the back. She had no idea yet whether Harriet Voss could win this case. She didn't know what winning even fully looked like at this stage, whether it meant the claim was thrown out, or whether it meant months of argument in a county court with a judge who might or might not be someone Briggs had a relationship with, or whether it meant something else entirely that she hadn't thought of yet. What she did know, sitting at her kitchen table with the attorney's letter in one hand and her own land document spread in front of her, was that she had spent 12 years building this ranch. She had done it once while grieving a husband, and once while recovering from an illness that had taken 3 of her neighbors. She had done it in mud and in drought and in winters, froze pipes and killed livestock, and made the whole enterprise seem like a losing proposition. She was not going to hand 400 acres of it to a man with a forged deed and a smile. She picked up her pencil. She went back to work. That Friday evening, the day before Harriet Voss was due to arrive, Cordelia was walking the fence line of the north pasture. She did this periodically, not always because something needed inspection, but because the land had a way of settling her when she couldn't settle herself by sitting still. She knew every inch of this pasture. She knew where the soil went soft in spring, and where the good grass grew earliest in the year, and where the fence posts were oldest, and which ones she'd replaced herself with a post-hole digger and her own hands the summer after her second husband died. She was at the northeast corner, where the fence turned south along the boundary she shared with a neighboring property. When she noticed the stakes, she stopped. There were 3 of them, driven into the ground along the fence line. New stakes, fresh wood, no weather on them. Each one had a small strip of orange cloth tied near the top. Survey markers. She crouched beside the nearest one. It had been driven into the ground recently, probably within the week, possibly within the last few days. The soil around the base was still slightly disturbed. She stood up. She looked north, then south, following the line the stakes implied. It didn't follow the existing fence exactly. It ran about 60 feet east of it. 60 feet. The same discrepancy she'd found in the survey documents at 2 in the morning last week. She stood there in the cold, looking at those orange flags moving slightly in the November wind, and she felt the anger arrive in a way that was different from the careful, managed kind she'd been carrying around all week. This was the kind that arrived when something abstract became concrete, when paperwork became stakes in the ground on land you had walked for 12 years. He had sent someone out here to mark the land before the case was even argued, before any judge had seen anything, before any court had made any determination. He was claiming it in practice before he claimed it in law, putting markers on her land so that anyone who rode past would see them and begin to wonder, begin to doubt, begin to whisper that maybe the wealthy widow's north pasture wasn't entirely her own after all. She pulled the nearest stake out of the ground. Then she pulled the second, then the third. She carried all three back across the pasture, through the gate and up to the house. She put them in the barn. Then she washed her hands and stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking at nothing. May found her there an hour later. "Cordelia, I'm all right." "You don't look all right." "I'm angry," she said. "That's different." May set a hand on her arm. "Harriet Voss comes tomorrow." "I know. What do you need tonight?" Cordelia thought about it. What she needed tonight was to not be alone with her own thoughts. And what she had was an empty ranch house and a stack of documents she'd already read 4 times, and no particular way to change either of those facts. "I need," she said, "for tomorrow to come faster." May stayed another hour. She made soup, and they ate it without much conversation, which was one of the things Cordelia valued most about May, the ability to be present without requiring the space to be filled. After May left, Cordelia checked the locks on the house, which she didn't usually do, and then felt slightly foolish for doing it, and then did it again anyway. She sat at the table. She pulled out a fresh piece of paper, and she began writing down every detail she could recall about those stakes, where exactly they were positioned, how deep they'd been driven, what the cloth looked like, what the wood looked like, because if Harlan Briggs was going to use paperwork against her, she was going to have paperwork on him too. Every detail, every date, every conversation she could document. She wrote until her hand cramped. Then she switched hands and kept writing. Outside, the November wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of her property. 400 acres of the best pasture in the county. Land she had earned and paid for and worked, and the sound of it was the only company she had. She didn't ask for more than that. She had learned, over 12 years and 2 graves, that the things worth keeping were worth fighting for quietly, without an audience, in the hours when nobody was watching. She intended to fight. Harriet Voss arrived on a gray Thursday morning in a buggy she was driving herself, which was the first thing Cordelia noticed. The second thing she noticed was that Harriet Voss was younger than her letter had suggested, mid-40s, maybe, with dark hair going silver at the temples and the kind of posture that came from spending years in rooms where people expected you not to be taken seriously, and you'd decided early on to make that their problem rather than yours. She tied off the horse herself, too. Didn't wait for Denny to come around. Cordelia met her at the back gate. "Mrs. Wexford, Miss Voss, come inside." They shook hands. Harriet Voss had a firm grip and didn't hold it a beat longer than necessary, which Cordelia appreciated. She'd dealt with enough people who used a handshake as an opportunity to establish something. May had coffee ready, and the kitchen cleared except for Cordelia's documents, which were arranged in 2 separate stacks on the table, her originals on the left, the copies of Briggs's filing on the right with her handwritten notes fanned out between them. Harriet Voss sat down, took off her coat without being invited to, and reached for the right-hand stack before she'd even touched the coffee. She read without speaking. She turned pages with the particular efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for, and wasn't going to waste time on anything else. Cordelia sat across from her and didn't try to fill the silence. May stood near the stove and pretended to wipe down a counter that was already clean. After 20 minutes, Harriet Voss set the last page down and picked up her coffee. "The notary stamp," she said. "Tell me what you noticed about it. It's from Custer County, 200 miles east. And the deed is supposedly from this county, 1,000 1869. A notary from Custer County had no routine business here in 1869. The territories weren't that interconnected. Harriet nodded once. That's the first thread. What else? The signature of the original grantor. It's been copied. The pen pressure is inconsistent, heavier on the letters a person presses into when they're tracing, lighter on the connecting strokes. Someone who signs their name from habit doesn't write it that way. Harriet looked at her over the rim of the coffee cup. You noticed that yourself. I've been looking at documents for 12 years. You learn what real ones look like. Good, Harriet said. That matters because you'll need to say exactly that, in exactly those words, in front of a judge who will be deciding whether you sound like someone who knows what she's talking about or someone who's grasping. She set the cup down. Who else has seen these copies? Gordon Albright at the county clerk's office. He told me off the record that he doesn't recognize the deed. Off the record isn't useful to me. Can he be persuaded to say it on the record? I don't know. He's careful. Careful people can be useful, or they can be obstacles. We'll need to figure out which kind he is. Harriet pulled Cordelia's handwritten notes toward her and scanned them. She stopped at the page about the survey stakes. Read it twice. These stakes. When exactly did you find them? Last Friday evening. Late afternoon before dark. And you removed them? Yes. Harriet was quiet for a moment. That was your instinct, and I understand it. It's also the thing Briggs's attorney will use if they know about it. They'll say you tampered with a surveyor's work. He put stakes on my land without a court order. He did. And a good judge knows that. But not every judge we might draw is a good one. She tapped the notes. You wrote down the positions. As precisely as I could. Do you have a surveyor you've worked with? John Edner. He did my fence line assessment 2 years ago. Can he go out there in the next week and document what the soil's disturbance looks like? The holes left behind when you pulled the stakes. Cordelia hadn't thought of that. Yes, I can ask him. Ask him today, this afternoon, if possible. Harriet folded her hands on the table. I want to tell you something about Harlan Briggs, and I want you to hear it straight. Go ahead. The case in the neighboring county I mentioned in my letter. A rancher named Devlin. Briggs used the same basic approach: old deed, obscure estate, gap in the public record. Devlin's attorney at the time tried to fight it on the merits of the deed itself, which was the right instinct but the wrong strategy, because Briggs had constructed the paperwork carefully enough that arguing the document alone was like trying to prove a painting is a forgery without a comparison piece. She paused. Devlin settled, gave up 40 acres rather than fight it out. 40 acres. He was tired and he had a sick wife and he didn't have a lawyer who understood what kind of fight it actually was. Harriet looked at Cordelia directly. This is not a land dispute. It is a fraud, executed through the legal system, by a man who has done it before and will keep doing it until someone stops him. Which means the way to beat it is not just to prove your deed is valid. It's to prove his isn't, and to prove it in a way that the county record reflects permanently. Cordelia held her gaze. What do you need from me? Everything. Every document, every conversation, every detail you can put on paper. The approach to your neighbor Lockridge, write that down too. Everything he told you. Every date he can recall. You think Briggs approaching Ephraim is connected. I think when a man files a fraudulent claim against one property and simultaneously approaches the neighboring property about a sale, it isn't coincidence. I think he's mapping the territory. She picked up the copy of the deed again. He's not just after your north pasture, Mrs. Wexford. He's after the consolidation. Your 400 acres and Lockridge's western section together would give him a corridor to the creek, which is worth considerably more than either piece separately. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind was picking up, and Cordelia could hear the weather vane on the barn turning. So he needs both, she said. Or he needs yours badly enough that Lockridge becomes less valuable to him strategically. But yes, I believe that's the picture. Harriet set the papers down. I'll file a formal response to the claim by end of next week. I'll request a preliminary hearing before it goes to trial. And I want to subpoena the notary in Custer County if that stamp was used without authorization, or if the notary is willing to testify they never witnessed that signature. We may be able to have the claim dismissed before it becomes a full trial. And if the notary isn't cooperative, then we go a longer way around. Harriet picked up her coffee again. I've gone longer ways around before. After Harriet left that afternoon, Cordelia stood in the kitchen for a long time without doing anything in particular. May had already gone home. The house was quiet. The documents were still on the table, and the afternoon light was coming through the west window at a low angle, catching the edges of the papers and making them look almost warm. She sent word to John Edner the following morning. He came out 3 days later, with his surveying equipment and a young assistant who didn't say much, and the two of them spent most of a cold morning walking the northeast fence line and documenting the soil's disturbance where the stakes had been. John Edner had been surveying in Red Willow County for 20 years and was not a man who said more than he needed to. But when he came back to the house afterward, he sat down at Cordelia's kitchen table and spread out his field notes and looked at her with the expression of someone who had found something worth finding. There's 3 distinct holes, he said. Spacing and depth are consistent with boundary stakes. And there's boot prints. More than one set, he tapped his notes. Somebody was out there recently. Within the last 2 weeks, based on the weathering. Can you document it officially? Already did. This morning's work is in my survey log. I'll write it up as a field observation. It's not a full survey, but it's a dated professional record that something was placed and removed from that location. That's what I need, Cordelia. He said her name in the way that older men in Red Willow sometimes did, like they'd known her since before the second husband, since before the first, since before the land was entirely hers. Who is doing this to you? You know who. He nodded. He'd been around long enough to know Harlan Briggs's work when he saw it, even when he couldn't prove it directly. He gathered his papers and his hat and stood up. You've got the best north pasture in the county. Has been since before you owned it. Everybody who knows land knows that. I know. Don't let him take it. I'm not planning to. He went back out to collect his assistant and his equipment, and Cordelia watched him go from the kitchen window and then turned back to the table, where yet another piece of documentation had been added to the growing stack. That Saturday, Ephraim and Tobin came, another wagon load of pine. Tobin was talking before the wagon fully stopped, something about an arithmetic problem at school that he was convinced had been graded wrong, and Cordelia found herself smiling before she entirely meant to. She'd been keeping her distance. Not physically, she'd let them stack wood both previous weeks, let Tobin come inside for cornbread and conversation, but the particular kind of distance a person maintains when they're afraid that caring about something is going to cost them. She had a lot of practice at that kind of distance. It was one of the things she'd gotten better at over the years and liked least about herself. But there was something about Tobin Lockridge that made distance difficult to sustain. He was not a child who performed for adults who got louder or more careful when he knew he was being watched. He was exactly the same whether you were paying attention to him or not, which was its own unusual quality, and one that Cordelia found herself respecting in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She offered payment again, as she had every week, and Ephraim declined again, as he had every week, and they had the same brief exchange they always had about it, which had started to feel less like an argument and more like a ritual, a thing they did because it was the form the conversation took. Afterward, when the wood was stacked and Tobin was inside with May, working through his arithmetic complaint, Ephraim stood near the gate with his coat collar turned up against the cold and looked at the north pasture in the way that ranchers look at land reading it rather than just seeing it. Your lawyer came, he said. It wasn't a question. Thursday. And it's worse than I hoped and better than I feared. She thinks she can have the claim dismissed at a preliminary hearing if the notary doesn't cooperate with Briggs. And if the notary does cooperate, then it becomes a trial, which takes longer and costs more and gives Briggs more time to do whatever else he has planned. Ephraim was quiet for a moment. A crow landed on the fence post nearest them, looked at them both with that particular crow expression that suggests complete indifference to human concerns, and flew off again. He came back to my place, Ephraim said. Cordelia turned to look at him. When? Wednesday. Earlier this week. Brought a different offer. Higher number. He paused, and said something I want you to know about. Tell me. He said that your legal situation was likely to get expensive and distracting, and that a woman in your position might find it useful to have liquid capital rather than land that was tied up in a dispute. Ephraim's jaw was set in the way that it got when he was keeping his voice level deliberately. He suggested that if you needed to sell some acreage quickly to cover legal costs, I should know that he'd be willing to buy at fair market. Cordelia stared at him. He told you I might need to sell. In so many words. So he's trying to run the legal costs up and then position himself as my buyer when I can't sustain them. That's what it sounded like to me. She turned away from him and looked at the north pasture. The grass was dead and brown now, flattened under the November weather, but she knew what it looked like in April, how it came up thick and early, ahead of most pasture in the county, because the drainage was right and the soil held moisture through the dry spells. She knew it the way you know the face of someone you've looked at for 12 years. "What did you tell him?" she said. "That I wasn't interested in selling, and that I didn't think you were either." A pause. He smiled. He always smiles. "I know. I don't think it means what a smile is supposed to mean." She almost laughed. Not because it was funny. "No," she said. "It doesn't." They stood there for a moment, both of them looking at the pasture, the cold settling around them in that particular late November way that wasn't quite dangerous but reminded you it could be. "I want to tell Harriet Voss what he said to you," Cordelia said. "Can I share it? With your name attached?" "Yes. He may come back after that and be less pleasant." "I expect so." Ephraim picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the fence post. "Mrs. Wexford." "Cordelia." He said both, like he wasn't sure which one was right for this conversation and was covering his bases. "I didn't come here every Saturday because I expected anything from it. Tobin wanted to, and I thought it was the right thing, and that was the whole of it. But I want you to know whatever Briggs tries, he's not going to run me off by making me uncomfortable at my own gate. If telling your lawyer what he said to me helps, then that's just information going to where it's useful." She looked at him for a moment. He had a sunburn across his nose and forehead that had been there since she first met him, and apparently wasn't going anywhere, and there was a frayed spot on his collar that he'd made some effort to mend but hadn't quite gotten right. And he was standing on the cold side of her fence in November, talking about not being run off by a man who'd been acquiring land through fraud for years. And he said it without posturing. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way she hadn't meant a polite phrase in longer than she wanted to think about. He nodded and went inside to collect Tobin. She wrote to Harriet Voss that afternoon. The preliminary hearing was set for the 3rd week of December, which gave Harriet 5 weeks to prepare and Briggs 5 weeks to do whatever he was going to do in the meantime. He did not leave those 5 weeks unused. Cordelia tracked it through the same network that had told her about the filing in the first place, May's connections, Gordon Albright's careful non-statements, the butcher's wife, the woman who ran the post office and had eyes like a courthouse clerk. Briggs met with 2 members of the county commissioner's office. He had lunch at the hotel dining room with a man nobody recognized, who arrived on the Tuesday stage and left the following morning. He filed a secondary document at the clerk's office, not a new claim, but an addendum to the survey line description. In the survey line description incorporated a second historical reference Cordelia's own documents didn't address directly. That addendum arrived via official notice on a Monday morning, and Cordelia was on her horse to the telegraph office within the hour. Harriet Voss replied by return telegraph the same afternoon. She'd already heard. She was already adapting. She needed Cordelia to pull the county commissioner meeting minutes from the last 2 years and identify every vote or decision that had Briggs's fingerprints on it. Not obvious ones, subtle ones. Pattern documentation. Cordelia spent 3 days in the county records room, doing exactly that. Gordon Albright watched her from his desk with the expression of a man who had decided something without quite articulating it to himself yet. On the 3rd afternoon, as she was putting on her coat to leave, he spoke. "There's a decision from 14 months ago," he said. "Survey boundary variance. Approved by the commission on a 2-to-1 vote. I remember it because I thought the application was unusual, and I said so, but it wasn't my decision to make." He looked at his desk. "If you're building a pattern, that might be a piece of it." She turned around. "Can I see the file?" He got up and found it himself, which he didn't have to do, and set it on the counter. "I'll be at the back of the room," he said, "if you need anything." It took her 40 minutes to read the file. What she found was this. 14 months ago, someone had applied for a survey boundary variance on a small piece of property on the south side of the county, a property that, as far as she could tell, had nothing to do with anything. But the variance had been approved using a specific procedural interpretation of the county's land code. An interpretation that, when she compared it to the approach in Briggs's current filing, used the same logic. The same language in some places, nearly word for word. The application had been filed by a company name she didn't recognize. She wrote it down. She took it home. She wrote it in her notes. She wrote it in a letter to Harriet Voss that she mailed that same evening. Harriet's reply came 4 days later, and it was brief. The company name was a land brokerage registered in Billings. Its principal officer, on record with the Territorial Business Registry, was a man who shared a surname with Harlan Briggs' brother-in-law. He had been laying this groundwork for over a year. Cordelia sat with that for a long moment. Then she picked up her pencil and kept writing. 2 weeks before the preliminary hearing, on a Saturday that was colder than any they'd had so far, Ephraim and Tobin came with what Ephraim said might be the last big load before the worst of winter set and the roads would get difficult soon, and he didn't want to risk the wagon in heavy snow. Tobin had a scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face, and his ears were red, and he was still talking, the scarf muffling every third word so that his sentences arrived partially. Cordelia brought them inside faster than usual. The cold had teeth that morning. Tobin unwound the scarf and immediately asked whether she'd found out if the arithmetic problem had been graded right. He'd been carrying this grievance for 2 weeks. I didn't look into it, she said. He accepted this with the stoic disappointment of a child who had suspected as much. I'm still right, he said. The answer is 14 and misses. Alderman said 12 and she's wrong. What's the problem? He told her. She worked it out on the back of an envelope. The answer was 14. Tobin looked at his father with the expression of a person who has been told they were wrong and has just been proven right in front of a witness. I'm not telling Mrs. Alderman, Ephraim said. Why not? Because you have to sit in her classroom until June. Tobin considered the strategic reality. That's fair, he said, with the resigned practicality of someone who has thought about it and accepts it as a necessary constraint. He picked up his cornbread. Cordelia looked at Ephraim. The hearing is in 2 weeks. He nodded. Harriet thinks we have enough for a dismissal. Maybe. The notary in Custer County won't testify. She got word back that the man claims not to remember the transaction, which tells us something. But a man who won't remember isn't the same as a man who'll say he never did it. So the stamp might hold. But we have the pattern. The brokerage connection. John Edner's field notes. Your testimony about what Briggs said at your gate. She set her hands flat on the table. Harriet says the judge for the preliminary is a man named Thatcher. She knows his record. He's not Briggs's man, but he's careful, and careful can go either way. Ephraim was quiet for a moment. What happens if the preliminary doesn't go your way? Then it goes to a full trial, which means months. Costs. Briggs gets to keep his claim active while we argue it. She said it plainly because there was no other useful way to say it, and he'll use that time. He's already been using time. Tobin had gone quiet. She looked at him and found him watching her with that particular attention of his not anxious, exactly. More like he was taking careful inventory of the situation and filing it somewhere. You're going to win, he said. Tobin Ephraim started. I don't know that, Cordelia said to the boy. I'm trying to. That's the same thing, Tobin said. Mostly, she looked at him. 9 years old. Sitting at her kitchen table with his ears still red from the cold, and his arithmetic grievance resolved, and his complete and apparently unshakable conviction that trying hard enough and the right outcome were roughly the same thing. She was not 9 years old. She did not share his certainty. But she found, sitting there, that she was glad someone in the room had it. Stack the last of the wood before you go, she said. The east wall, where it's sheltered. He jumped down from the chair and went. The week before the hearing, Briggs made his final move before the courtroom. It came in the form of a letter, delivered by hand to her front gate, written on his personal stationery in a hand that was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who was not worried about what he was putting on paper because he'd done this before and knew how much of it mattered in the end. He expressed regret that the situation had reached a legal stage. He said he had no desire to cause distress to a woman he respected. He offered to settle the matter privately, a payment to Cordelia for the fair market value of the disputed parcel, which would allow her to avoid the costs and uncertainty of a hearing. He noted that it was not his preference to see a widow of her standing placed in a difficult position by the courts. She read it 3 times. The phrase widow of her standing she read 4 times. Then she folded it, put it in her document stack, and wrote at the top of the page in her own hand, received 10 days before preliminary hearing. Offer to settle implies awareness that claim may not hold at hearing. Retained as evidence of negotiation attempt. She mailed a copy to Harriet Voss the same day. Harriet's response was a single line, good. Save everything. The night before the hearing, Cordelia did not sleep well. This was not unexpected. She hadn't slept well in 3 weeks, but the particular quality of the wakefulness was different. Earlier in the process, the sleeplessness had been anxious, turning over questions and possibilities she couldn't control. This was something else, calmer and harder at the same time. She lay in bed in the dark and went through every document she'd filed with Harriet, every date, every name, every piece of evidence she'd collected, not because she needed to review it again, but because the process of going through it steadied her. She had the deed. She had the survey history. She had John Edner's field notes on the stakes. She had Gordon Albright's willingness cautious, careful, but real to say on the record that the filed deed was unfamiliar to him. She had the pattern documentation from the county records. She had Ephraim's account of what Briggs had said at his gate. She had the settlement letter with her annotation on it. She had built the best case she could build with what she had. That was all she'd ever been able to do. With the ranch, with the 2 marriages, with every hard season she'd gotten through by working through it rather than waiting for it to end. You built the best thing you could build with the materials available, and then you stood behind it. At some point before first light, she fell asleep. She woke before dawn. She dressed carefully, not for vanity, but because she'd learned that how you walked into a room affected what people in that room were prepared to believe about you before you opened your mouth. She ate breakfast. She reviewed nothing. The time for reviewing was over. She rode into Red Willow in the cold gray of early morning, her breath coming visible in the air, her horse moving steadily on the frozen road. Harriet Voss was already at the courthouse when she arrived. She was standing outside in her coat, drinking coffee from a tin cup she'd apparently brought herself, reviewing notes with the focused attention of someone running through a final checklist. She looked up when Cordelia dismounted. "Ready," she said. Not a question. Yes, Cordelia said, it was not entirely true, but it was close enough to function as true, which was the only kind of ready that ever existed, in rooms where things actually mattered. They went inside. The courtroom in Red Willow was not built for drama. It was a plain room on the second floor of the county building, with wooden benches that had seen better decades, 2 tall windows that let in more draft than light, and a judge's bench that was slightly too high for the room, giving whoever sat behind it the look of someone who'd been placed there by accident and decided to make the best of it. Judge Thatcher was 60-something, with a gray mustache that needed trimming and the particular stillness of a man who had heard enough arguments in enough rooms to know that the first thing most people said was rarely the most important. He had a reputation for patience that some people mistook for slowness, and Harriet Voss had told Cordelia that morning not to make that mistake. "He hears everything," Harriet said. "He just doesn't react to everything." Those are different. The room had maybe 20 people in it. More than a preliminary hearing typically drew, which meant that word had gotten around, which meant that Harlan Briggs had allowed word to get around, because that was how he operated. He sat at the opposing table in a dark coat that fit him well, with an attorney beside him named Rutherford Crane, a Billings man, expensive, with the groomed look of someone who charged by the quarter hour and knew it. Crane had a younger associate next to him who spent the first 10 minutes arranging papers in a way that was probably meant to look organized and instead looked like he was stalling. Briggs looked at Cordelia once when she came in, just once, and briefly, and then he looked away, which was its own kind of statement. He didn't think she was a problem worth watching. She sat down beside Harriet and put her hands flat on the table and kept them there. Harriet had told her what to expect. The preliminary hearing was not a trial. No witnesses would be sworn in today. The purpose was for the judge to determine whether the claim had sufficient legal basis to proceed to a full trial, or whether it should be dismissed outright. Harriet would argue for dismissal. Crane would argue for proceeding. Thatcher would ask questions. What Harriet had not told her, what she probably hadn't known, was that Rutherford Crane would open with something Cordelia wasn't prepared for. He stood up, he introduced himself. He laid out, in smooth and unhurried language, the basis of his client's claim, the 1,869 deed, the Pratt estate, the chain of ownership, the survey line discrepancy. He said all of this with the confidence of a man reading from something he'd memorized, which was both impressive and slightly unnatural sounding. The way a rehearsed thing is never quite as convincing as a thought-through one. And then he said, "Your Honor, we would like to submit into evidence a sworn affidavit from the notary public in Custer County, whose stamp appears on the original deed." Harriet went still beside her. Cordelia felt it rather than saw it. She looked at Harriet. Harriet's expression did not change. But her right hand, which had been resting on her notepad, moved 1 inch to the left and stopped. The notary had come through, or been brought through, or had found a version of his memory that was suddenly very clear about a deed he had told Harriet's inquiries he couldn't recall. Judge Thatcher took the affidavit from Crane's associate and read it without expression. Harriet made a note. Cordelia watched the judge's face and learned nothing from it. When Crane finished, Harriet stood. She was not as polished as Crane. She didn't have his particular brand of ease, the kind that comes from having won enough times in enough rooms to feel at home in all of them. What she had was something different, a quality of precision that tightened as she went, so that by the time she reached her main argument, she was speaking with the focused density of someone who had cut everything extraneous as away and left only what mattered. She challenged the deed on 3 grounds. The provenance of the notary stamp, noting that the affidavit submitted today was the first time any notary recollection had surfaced, despite prior inquiries. The signature inconsistency Cordelia had identified, which she framed not as Cordelia's amateur opinion, but as a pattern observable to anyone familiar with period documents. And the survey line discrepancy, which she argued was not an error in Cordelia's 1,879 survey, but a deliberate misalignment in the 1,869 document introduced to create exactly the kind of ambiguity that would make a fraudulent claim difficult to disprove quickly. Then she said, "Your Honor, we also wish to present evidence of a pattern of similar filings made through a brokerage entity connected to the claimant, including a survey boundary variance approved by this county's commission 14 months ago, using identical procedural language to the current claim." Crane was on his feet. "Objection. The commission decision is unrelated to this matter. It's a pattern of conduct, Your Honor," Harriet said, without raising her voice. "The objection is noted," Thatcher said. "Continue, Miss Voss." She continued. She laid out the brokerage connection, the company name, the business registry, the shared surname with Briggs's brother-in-law. She laid it out without flourish, just the chain of facts, each one linked to the next. She presented John Edner's field notes on the survey stakes, described what they documented, and noted that the stakes had been placed on disputed property before any court determination, a preemptive act of possession that had no legal authorization. She presented the settlement letter Briggs had sent 10 days before the hearing, with Cordelia's annotation, noting the timing and what it implied. And then she said something Cordelia hadn't expected. "Finally, Your Honor, I'd like to submit a signed statement from Mr. Ephraim Lockridge of this county, describing a conversation in which the claimant suggested that Mrs. Wexford might find it necessary to sell disputed acreage due to legal costs, a statement made, while simultaneously approaching Mr. Lockridge about purchasing his own neighboring property. Taken together, these conversations describe not a good faith land claim, but a coordinated pressure campaign designed to force the sale of property the claimant could not acquire through legitimate means. The room was quiet, not the polite quiet of people waiting for the next thing to happen, the particular quiet of people recalibrating. Cordelia had not known Harriet was going to use that phrase. Coordinated pressure campaign. She had given Harriet the facts. Harriet had found the frame. She looked at Harlan Briggs. He was looking at his attorney. Crane was writing something on a notepad. His face was controlled, but the set of his jaw was different than it had been 10 minutes ago. Judge Thatcher took a recess. He came back 35 minutes later. Cordelia had spent those 35 minutes sitting very still in the hallway bench outside the courtroom, while Harriet walked back and forth along the window at the end of the hall, not talking, working through something internally that she hadn't chosen to share. Cordelia had not asked. Harriet would say what was useful to say when it was useful. When Thatcher came back, he sat down and looked at both tables for a long moment. "The notary affidavit troubles me," he said. "Not its existence, its timing. The chain of inquiry in this matter is documented, and this court has no record of the affidavit being available at any prior point." He folded his hands. "That said, it is a sworn document, and this court cannot simply disregard it." Crane straightened slightly. "However," Thatcher continued, "the pattern evidence presented by the respondent's counsel is also not something this court can simply disregard. The procedural similarity between this claim and the prior boundary variance, the brokerage connection, the conduct described in the Lockridge statement, taken individually, any one of these might be explained. Together they describe something this court is obligated to take seriously. He looked at his papers. I am not dismissing this claim today, he said. Cordelia felt something drop. But I am also not sending it to trial as currently constituted. I am ordering an independent survey of the contested boundary line to be conducted by a surveyor appointed by this court within the next 60 days. I am also ordering that the notary's affidavit be examined by a document expert appointed by this court, not by either party, for a determination of its authenticity. Both examinations will be completed before any trial date is set. He looked at Crane. The claimant will bear the cost of the independent survey. The respondent will bear the cost of the document examination. He looked at Harriet. If the document examination returns a finding of authenticity, we proceed to trial. If it does not, we revisit the question of dismissal. Is that clear to both parties? Yes, Your Honor, Harriet said. Crane said it half a second later, which was not a meaningful delay, but was a measurable one. Thatcher banged his gavel. The room began to move. In the hallway afterward, Harriet put on her coat with the precise movements of someone managing her energy carefully. It's not a win, she said. I know, but it's not a loss. He didn't buy the claim. He's buying time to examine it properly, which is what a careful judge does. And by ordering the document examination at Briggs's expense for the survey, she caught herself, at each party's respective expense. He's signaling that he found the pattern evidence credible. The notary, Cordelia said. Yes. Harriet was quiet for a moment. I should have anticipated that. I made inquiries, I got a non-response. I interpreted that as unavailability rather than buying time. She said it plainly, without excessive apology. I should have pushed harder. You didn't know he'd produce an affidavit. No. But I should have prepared for the possibility. She buttoned the top button of her coat. What I need to do now is find out exactly when that affidavit was signed and what the notary was offered or told. Because a man who couldn't recall a transaction 3 weeks ago and can suddenly recall it in exacting detail the morning of a hearing didn't recover that memory on his own. Cordelia nodded. What can I do? Go home. Maintain your operations on the North Pasture exactly as you have been. Don't stop using that land for a single day. Continued use is evidence of continuous possession, and we want the record to show that the respondent never treated that parcel as anything other than her own. Harriet picked up her bag. And write down everything that happens. Every unusual visitor, every conversation, everything that seems out of place. The next 60 days are going to be Briggs's window to create pressure, and he knows it. She left through the front door. Cordelia stood in the hallway for a moment, alone. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up. Harlan Briggs appeared at the top of the courthouse stairs, his coat on, his hat in his hand. His attorney was behind him. He looked at Cordelia with the expression she'd come to expect from him, calm, considered, not hostile exactly, the look of someone who didn't think of what he was doing as hostile because he thought of it as business. Mrs. Wexford, he said, I hope this proceeding wasn't too taxing. She looked at him. I'm fine, Mr. Briggs. Good. He settled his hat. I want you to know I don't hold any of this against you personally. These things happen. People have competing claims on land all the time, and the courts sort them out. That's what they're for. I agree, she said. That's exactly what they're for. Something moved behind his eyes. Not worry, something more like reassessment. Like he'd expected a different response, and was noting the one he got. The next few months may be difficult, he said. Most things worth doing are. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, put his hat on, and walked down the stairs. She watched him go. Then she went downstairs herself, collected her horse from the post, and rode home. That evening, Ephraim came by himself. No wagon, no Tobin was at a schoolmate's house for the night, which Ephraim mentioned without explanation, as though the fact of a 9-year-old being somewhere else for an evening was not worth elaborating on. He stood on her porch, and she told him what had happened. All of it, the notary affidavit, Thatcher's order, the 60-day timeline, what Harriet had said in the hallway. He listened without interrupting, which she'd noticed was a habit of his. Some people who listened without interrupting did it because they were waiting for their turn to talk. Ephraim did it because he was actually listening. The document examination, he said when she finished. If the affidavit comes back as fabricated, then we go back to Thatcher and argue for dismissal. And if it comes back authentic, then we go to trial. And we argue the pattern, the pressure campaign, all of it, which is harder and longer and more expensive. She said it the same way she'd said it to Harriet. Plain, your legal costs, Ephraim said. How are they? She looked at him. I'm not offering anything, he said quickly, in the tone of someone who knows how the offer is going to land. I'm asking. I can sustain them, she said, for now. If it goes to trial, it becomes a real question. He nodded. He looked out at the north pasture, which was dark and invisible in the November night, except for the fence line where the moonlight caught the top rail. The statement I gave Harriet, he said. What Briggs said to me at my gate. Yes, it was the right thing to do. I know. I'm telling you because he stopped. Started again. I want to be clear that I didn't give it because I expected anything in return. I gave it because it was true and it was useful to you, and because what he's doing is wrong. Those are the only reasons. She studied his profile in the dark. The frayed collar she'd noticed weeks ago. The burned skin across his nose that didn't go away with the weather. Ephraim, she said. I know that. Good. He shifted his weight. I just wanted it said. It said. He went home shortly after. She stood on the porch and watched the light from his lantern move down the road until the trees took it. Inside, she sat at the kitchen table. May had left soup on the stove, and she ate it without particularly tasting it. And then she sat with the empty bowl and the document spread in front of her and thought about the 60 days ahead. 60 days for the independent surveyor to do his work. 60 days for the document examiner to assess the notary affidavit. 60 days in which Briggs would be doing whatever he was going to do next. She thought about what Harriet had said. Maintain your operations on the north pasture exactly as you have been. Don't stop using that land for a single day. She went to bed. She woke before dawn. She rode the north pasture. The following week, 2 things happened that she recorded in her notes. The first was that a stranger appeared in Red Willow, a young man, well-dressed for the territory, who told people at the Mercantile that he was a land assessor doing routine property valuations for a Billings investment concern. He asked questions around town, friendly and casual, about property values and land use in the county. Someone told May he'd ask specifically about the Wexford ranch. May told Cordelia. Cordelia wrote it down, date, description, the specific questions May had been told about. She sent a telegraph to Harriet the same afternoon. Harriet responded, document everything, don't engage, don't avoid, normal operation. The second thing was that Gordon Albright came to see her, not at the courthouse at her ranch, on a Tuesday afternoon, in his own buggy. He sat at her kitchen table and put his hands around a coffee cup and looked like a man who had been arguing with himself for a long time and had finally arrived at the end of the argument. The commission meeting, he said, the one 14 months ago, the survey boundary variance. She waited. I was there, he said. I'm the county clerk. I'm at every meeting. He looked at his coffee. The man who filed that variance application he met with 2 commissioners the week before the vote. I saw them talking. Didn't think much of it at the time. Commission members talk to applicants all the time. But now you think differently. I think I've been thinking about it since your lawyer mentioned it in the hearing. He shifted in his chair. I don't know what they talked about. I can't tell you that. But I can tell you the names of the 2 commissioners who voted to approve, and I can tell you that both of them voted on matters that benefit a company I now believe is connected to Briggs at least twice in the past 2 years. He stopped. I'm telling you this because I've worked in that office for 17 years, and I know what a county record is supposed to look like and what this feels like. What does it feel like? She said. He looked up at her. It feels like somebody's been using my office as a tool for a long time, and I didn't say I was looking at each piece individually instead of all of it at once. She held his gaze for a moment. Will you put that in writing? She said. Not the speculation, the facts you observed, the dates, the names, the votes. I'll need to review the records first to make sure I have the dates right. Of course. And I'd want to talk to your lawyer first, before I sign anything. Because once I sign something, I've signed it, and I want to understand what I'm signing into. That's fair, Cordelia said. I'll arrange it. He finished his coffee. He stood up and put his hat on and stood in her kitchen doorway for a moment. I should have paid closer attention years ago, he said. You're paying attention now, she said. That's not nothing. He left. She sat at the table. She wrote it all down before the detail could blur, getting it onto paper in the same way she'd learned to do everything in this process immediately precisely, without trusting her memory when a page was available. Then something else happened, and this one she hadn't predicted and couldn't have. On a Wednesday afternoon, 18 days after the hearing, she was working in the barn winter preparations, checking the condition of the stored hay, making sure the corner stalls were tight enough to hold warmth when Denny came and told her there was a boy at the gate, by himself. She put down the hay fork and went out. It was Tobin. He was sitting on his pony outside the gate, alone, which was unusual enough that her first reaction was concern. "Is your father all right?" she said. "He's fine," Tobin said. "He doesn't know I came." She looked at him. He was wearing his winter coat, and his hat was on straight for once, and he had an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Serious in a particular way that was different from his usual seriousness, which tended to be about problems he was actively solving. "Then why are you here?" she said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper, folded into quarters. He held it through the gate bars. She took it, unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map, rough, done in pencil, with corrections and erasures visible, the kind of map a 9-year-old makes when he's trying to be accurate about something and has had to start over at least once. It showed her north pasture boundary on one side and Ephraim's western acreage on the other, and between them, marked with a small careful X, was a location along the shared fence line. "What is this?" she said. "I found something," Tobin said. "Last week. I was following a calf that got through a gap in our fence, and I went further than I was supposed to, and I found there's something in the ground. Along your fence near our property line, new stakes. Different from the ones you already pulled out." She went very still. "More than 3, he said. I counted 7. She looked at the map. Then she looked at him. He was watching her with that careful inventory expression. "You counted them," she said. "And I didn't touch them," he said, with the tone of someone who has thought about this specifically. "I didn't touch them because I thought if there was some legal reason it mattered, touching them might be bad." A 9-year-old boy had found new survey stakes, identified them as significant, counted them without disturbing them, gone home, drawn a map, and ridden over alone because he thought the information was urgent. She folded the map. "Your father really doesn't know you're here. He went to get feed from the Aldner farm. He'll be back by supper." He paused. "I thought it might be important." "It is," she said. "Tobin, it's very important. Come inside. I'm not supposed to come inside anywhere without Dad knowing." "That's a good rule," she said. "Stay here." She went inside, got paper and ink, wrote a note to Harriet Voss, date, Tobin's information, location as described, request for Harriet to contact John Edner immediately. She sealed it, came back out. "I need you to take this to the telegraph office in town," she said. "Can you do that?" He straightened on his pony. "Yes, ma'am." "You tell them to send it to Harriet Voss in Helena and that it's urgent. I know where the telegraph office is." "I know you do." She handed him the note, and then, without quite planning to, she put her hand briefly on the top of his head, the way you do with someone you're fond of, and are proud of, and don't quite have words for. He accepted this without embarrassment. "Go straight there and straight home," she said. "Don't tell anyone what the note is about." He turned the pony around. "Tobin." He looked back. "Thank you," she said. "What you did coming here, not touching them, drawing the map. That was exactly right." He looked at her with that serious face. "I figured somebody who was already fighting should have all the information," he said. He rode off down the road. She stood at her gate and watched him go, the small figure on the pony getting smaller, and she felt something move in her chest that was separate from the case and the documents, and Harriet's strategy, and all of it something that had nothing to do with land or legal proceedings, and everything to do with the fact that a child she barely knew had paid enough attention to her situation to go out of his way, alone, on a Wednesday afternoon, because he thought she should have all the information. She had been careful for years not to let people matter too much. It was not a cruel habit, it came from reasonable cause. You lose people, and then you protect yourself from losing more by not letting them get close enough to be lost. She understood this about herself with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone who has examined her own patterns and accepted them even while knowing they were not entirely healthy. But watching Tobin ride away on his pony, she felt that careful distance begin to fail in a way she couldn't quite argue herself out of. She went back inside, she got her coat, she rode the fence line herself. Tobin's map was accurate. 7 new stakes, spaced at intervals along the boundary between her property and Ephraim's, running in a line that suggested not just a renewed claim on the north pasture, but a claim on the shared boundary itself, the corridor between the 2 properties that Harriet had identified as Briggs's real strategic target. He wasn't just pressing her, he was trying to claim the gap. She counted the stakes herself, like Tobin had. She photographed nothing. She had no means to photograph, but she noted every position in her memory and against the map, matching Tobin's marks to the actual locations. She did not touch them. She rode home. John Edner came the following morning. He documented all 7 stakes' positions, depths, soil disturbance, the age of the wood, which was fresh. He did it with the thoroughness of a man who understood that this particular field note was going to matter in a courtroom. And he wrote it up that afternoon and sent a copy to Harriet directly. Harriet was on the next available stage to Red Willow. She arrived on a Friday, 2 days after Tobin had come to the gate, and she sat at Cordelia's kitchen table with John Edner's documentation spread in front of her, and her hands folded on the table, and the particular expression on her face of someone who has been waiting for the other party to make an overreach. He did it again, she said. While the independent survey is still pending, while the document examination is still pending, he put new stakes on contested ground while this matter is still before the court. Yes, that's contempt of the court's process, Harriet said. Maybe not technical contempt, because no injunction was issued. But it is conduct that I can put in front of Judge Thatcher, and Thatcher will not like it. She picked up John Edner's notes. The corridor theory is confirmed. He's not after 400 acres. He's after the transit rights between your north pasture and Lockridge's western section. The creek access. She set the notes down. We need to file an emergency motion. Request a temporary injunction against any further physical alteration of the contested boundary. And I want to include the corridor evidence in the motion, so that Thatcher sees the full picture of what's actually being attempted here. Can you file it quickly? I can file it Monday. She looked up. Cordelia. How did you find the new stakes? She told her about Tobin. Harriet was quiet for a moment. A 9-year-old found them. He was following a calf, and he didn't touch them. He thought it might be legally significant. Harriet looked at her with an expression that was briefly, genuinely surprised, the expression of someone who deals in documents and strategy and legal language, and is occasionally reminded that the people at the center of these cases are doing something entirely different from what she does. His statement, Harriet said. I want a written account of what he found, date time, what he saw, that he didn't touch them. Can his father give consent for that? I'll ask. Ask tonight. She went to Ephraim's place that evening for the first time. She'd been to her own gate and to the fence line and to Red Willow, but she'd never ridden to his property before. It took 40 minutes on horseback, the road going west and then north along the creek line, and she arrived at dusk to find him in the yard pulling a harness off his horse and Tobin nearby, trying to convince a reluctant barn cat to come inside. Ephraim looked up when she came through the gate. He read her face. What happened, he said. She told him. All of it the new stakes, Tobin's role, Harriet's assessment, the emergency motion. He listened with his usual stillness, one hand resting on his horse's neck. When she finished, he looked at Tobin. Tobin was looking at the ground with the expression of someone who knows they went somewhere they weren't supposed to and is waiting to find out how serious it is. You went to Mrs. Wexford's, Ephraim said, without telling me. You were at the Aldner farm. That's not an answer. I thought it was important, Tobin said. And I didn't go inside anywhere. Ephraim looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Cordelia. Was it important, he said. It may change the whole course of this, she said. What he found, and that he didn't touch anything, and that he came straight to me with a map. She paused. Your son has a very clear head. Ephraim looked back at Tobin. Tobin was watching his father with careful attention. You still went without telling me, Ephraim said. That's not allowed. I know. We'll talk about it later. Tobin accepted this with the seriousness it deserved and went back to the barn cat. Ephraim watched him for a moment. The expression on his face was the complicated one, the one Cordelia had seen in her kitchen doorway on the first Saturday, the one that didn't have a clean name. His statement, she said. Harriet needs it in writing. She needs your consent because he's a minor. He'll give it, Ephraim said, and I'll give consent. He paused. Does she need to talk to him? She'd like to make sure she has the details right. He nodded. He looked at the last of the daylight over his fence line, and then he looked at her. Come inside, he said. It's cold and you rode 40 minutes. The least I can do is offer you a cup of something. She hesitated. Cordelia, he said, without pressure, just the word. Come inside. She tied her horse. She went inside. The kitchen in Ephraim's house was smaller than hers and considerably less organized, with the particular quality of a room managed by a man and a boy who are both doing their best and are neither of them primarily interested in organization. There was a pile of harness parts on one chair, a school book face down on the counter, a coat hanging off the back of another chair in the manner of someone who intended to hang it properly and then got distracted. She sat at the table. Tobin came in from the barn smelling of hay and made coffee with the practiced movements of a child who had been making coffee since he was old enough to reach the stove, which probably said something about his father's morning routine that Ephraim didn't need to elaborate on. They sat for a while, the three of them, in the small warm kitchen, with the coffee and the harness parts and the school book, in the last of the November dark. She didn't stay long, but she stayed long enough. Riding home, with the cold coming up from the ground and the stars visible now overhead, and her horse moving steadily on the familiar road, Cordelia thought about what 60 days actually meant, not as a legal timeline, as time. 60 days ago, she had been sitting at her kitchen table going over feed costs. Now she had a lawyer she trusted, a document examiner looking at a forged affidavit, a county clerk who'd finally looked at the whole picture instead of each piece, a surveyor with field notes on unauthorized stakes, and an emergency motion going in front of a judge on Monday. And she acknowledged to herself in the cold dark of the road home, a man and his son who had delivered firewood and arithmetic corrections and hand-drawn maps, and who had asked for nothing in return. She was not sentimental by nature. Life had pressed that tendency out of her with enough steady pressure that she'd stopped noticing its absence. But riding home on that cold November night, she allowed herself to feel, briefly and without fighting it, the particular weight of not being entirely alone in something hard. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was too unfamiliar for comfort, but it was real. And real, she had learned, was better than comfortable, most of the time, even when it wasn't easier. Harriet filed the emergency motion on Monday, as promised. By Wednesday, Judge Thatcher had read it. By Thursday, he had issued a temporary injunction prohibiting any further physical alteration of the contested boundary pending the completion of the independent survey and document examination. The injunction was 2 pages long and written in the careful language of a man who had read John Edner's field notes and Tobin's written account and Gordon Albright's preliminary statement and had arrived at a position he was prepared to defend. Cordelia read the injunction at her kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon, with May sitting across from her, and when she finished, she set it down and sat for a moment without speaking. "Good news," May said. "It was not a question." "Partial news," Cordelia said. "It stops him from putting more stakes in the ground. It doesn't stop anything else. It's something." "Yes," she said. "It's something." She wrote to Harriet that evening to confirm receipt. Harriet wrote back 2 days later with the next piece. The document examiner appointed by the court was a man named Aldous Frey, based in Helena, who had spent 20 years working with historical documents for the territorial government and had testified as an expert in 4 previous land fraud cases. His examination of the notary affidavit would take approximately 3 weeks. His examination of the original deed document, the one filed by Briggs at the county clerk's office, would take another week after that. 4 weeks. Cordelia counted them on the calendar on her kitchen wall, marked them in pencil, and then made herself stop looking at the calendar because there was no productive way to spend those 4 weeks staring at it. She threw herself into the ranch instead. Winter had arrived in earnest, and there was enough genuine work to occupy every hour she was willing to give it. The cattle needed managing in the cold, checking water sources, making sure the younger animals were cycling through the sheltered section of the pasture in rotation, watching for any signs of illness that the cold would turn serious faster than it would in other seasons. 3 fence sections needed attention before the deep freeze made repairs impossible. The stored hay in the east barn was developing a moisture problem in the far corner that needed to be addressed before it spread. She worked. She documented. She wrote down everything that happened, or seemed worth noting: the dates she rode the north pasture, the condition of the fence line each time, any strangers who appeared on the road, any conversations that felt unusual. She was building a record of continuous possession and normal operation, and she did it with the same systematic attention she gave her feed costs and her cattle records. Because Harriet had told her to, and because it was the right thing to do, and because working kept the anxiety from settling permanently into her chest. Ephraim came on Saturdays, still with firewood, though the loads were smaller now because the roads had gotten difficult, and he was being careful with the wagon axle in the cold. Tobin came too, always. Until one Saturday in late December when Ephraim arrived alone, because Tobin had caught a cold, and May, who had somehow become Tobin's most enthusiastic advocate in absentia, had already sent word that she was bringing soup to Ephraim's place on Sunday, and Tobin was not to come out until the cold had run its course. Cordelia stood at the gate and looked at the wagon. Just Ephraim, a half-load of pine, and the particular quality of quiet that follows a child's absence when you've gotten used to the child being present. "How bad is it?" she said. "He's fine," annoyed at being kept inside. Ephraim climbed down. "He made me promise to report everything to him." To him. He started unloading wood. "He wants to know if there are any developments on the case. Tell him the injunction held, and Aldous Frey is examining the documents. He'll want to know what that means practically. Tell him it means we're waiting, which is the hardest part." Ephraim carried an armload toward the east wall. He knows that already. He's 9, not naive. She helped him unload, which she hadn't done on previous Saturdays she'd directed and he'd carried, which was its own kind of arrangement. But with only the two of them and a half-load, it seemed foolish to stand to the side. They worked without talking for a while, the cold making their breath visible, the sound of split pine stacking against the house wall in the particular dry way that well-seasoned wood has. "Harriet said something to me last week," Cordelia said when most of the load was stacked. "She said that when this is over either way, Briggs is going to need somewhere to redirect his attention, and that I should be thinking now about what I want the record to reflect about this property when this is done." Ephraim set the last piece on the stack and looked at her. "What does that mean practically?" "She means that if we win, if the claim is dismissed and the fraud is documented in the public record, Briggs is going to lose credibility in this county, which matters because he's been using this county's legal machinery to do his work. If the machinery stops cooperating, his approach doesn't work anymore." She paused. "But if we lose, or if it goes to trial and drags on, the record of dispute itself damages the property value and makes future operations harder. So she wants you to be thinking about the long game. She wants me to be thinking about what this ranch looks like on the other side of whatever happens." Ephraim was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the pasture, the same sound it always made, the sound she'd fallen asleep to 1,000 nights. "What do you think it looks like?" he said. She looked at the north pasture. "I think it looks the way it always has. I'm not changing what I do with it based on what he's attempting. That's not what I'm asking." She turned to look at him. He had his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in that way he did when he was saying something he'd thought about. "I'm asking what you want it to look like," he said. Not defensively, not in response to Briggs. Just what you want. It was an unusual question. Most of the conversations she'd had about this ranch in the past 3 months had been about preservation, defense, maintaining position. Nobody had asked her what she wanted it to become. "I want the north pasture back in full productive use by spring," she said. "Not because of the case, because it's been underutilized for 2 years and that's a waste." She paused, thinking about it honestly. "I want to replant the orchard section on the east side. It was my first husband's project and I let it go after he died, and I've been sorry about that." She paused again. "And I've been thinking about the creek corridor, the shared boundary between my land and yours. If that corridor were managed properly, not disputed, not claimed, just managed, it would be significantly more productive for both operations." Ephraim looked at her steadily. "You've been thinking about my land." "I've been thinking about the corridor," she said. "There's a difference, is there?" She held his gaze. This was the kind of conversation that could go 2 ways, and she was aware of both of them, and she wasn't entirely sure which one she was steering toward, which was unusual for her. She generally knew exactly where she was steering. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded. "Fair enough." He put his hat back on. "For what it's worth, I've been thinking about the corridor too. And the orchard, if you want an extra set of hands for the replanting. I know fruit trees. You haven't mentioned that before. You hadn't mentioned the orchard before." She almost smiled. "Come inside." May left bread. The document examiner's preliminary report arrived in the first week of January. Harriet sent it by telegraph in a compressed summary because the full written report would take another week by post, and the summary was enough to understand the direction. Aldous Frey had examined the notary affidavit. He had found 3 indicators of recent fabrication in a document purporting to be contemporary with the original transaction, ink composition inconsistent with the period, a paper weight and texture not in common use before 1890, and a procedural format in the notarial language that postdated the supposed transaction by at least 15 years. He had not yet examined the original deed, but his preliminary finding on the affidavit was that it was not authentic. Cordelia read the telegraph summary 3 times. Then she sat down. May came in from the back room and looked at her face. "Tell me," she told her. May sat down across from her and pressed her lips together in the particular way she did when she was managing a strong emotion that she felt wasn't hers to express. "So it was faked," May said. "The affidavit. Preliminary finding. He still needs to examine the original deed. But the affidavit that was supposed to prove the deed was real, that's fake. That's what the preliminary finding says." May was quiet for a moment. "That man stood up in court and submitted a fake document. His attorney submitted it. Whether Crane knew Cordelia. I know. What happens now? Harriet files a motion to present the preliminary findings to Thatcher. Thatcher can accelerate the timeline for a decision. If Frey's full report confirms the preliminary, the affidavit is thrown out, and without the affidavit, Briggs's claim on the deed loses its primary authentication." She paused. "Then we argue for dismissal again, but this time with the fraud documented." May sat back. "Is it over?" "I don't know yet. Briggs has a different attorney now. Crane withdrew from the case 2 days ago. His office sent Harriet a notice. No explanation, but you don't need to read far between the lines." She folded the telegraph summary. "A new attorney means a new strategy, which means Briggs hasn't given up." May looked at her. "After all of this, he still hasn't given up." "No." Cordelia put the summary in her document stack. "But neither have I." She wrote to Harriet immediately. Harriet's response came the following day, and it was longer than usual, 3 pages, which for Harriet meant something was complicated, and she needed Cordelia to understand the full picture. The full picture was this: Rutherford Crane's withdrawal was significant, and not just because it signaled that even a Billings attorney with a strong appetite for difficult cases had decided Briggs' matter was no longer worth his professional association. Crane's withdrawal, filed with the court, meant the record now contained the fact of his departure, which a careful judge in Thatcher was a careful judge would note. Attorneys didn't abandon ongoing cases casually. They abandoned them when continuing became a liability. But Briggs had hired a replacement. A local man named Gerald Mott, whose practice was primarily agricultural contracts and minor disputes, and who had, as far as Harriet could determine, no particular experience with contested land claims of this complexity. Which could mean one of 2 things. It could mean Briggs was preparing to settle, or it could mean he was preparing to do something different enough from the original approach that he needed a different kind of attorney, someone local, someone with relationships in the county, someone who knew which levers to pull at the community level rather than the legal one. Harriet wrote, "I don't know which of these it is yet. Be careful." Cordelia read that line twice. Be careful was not a phrase Harriet used loosely. She went to see Gordon Albright the following morning. He was at his desk when she came in, which was always where he was, and he looked up with the expression of a man who had been expecting her to come by. "Gerald Mott," she said. "I heard," he said. "What do you know about him?" Gordon took his glasses off and cleaned them with the corner of his shirt, which was a habit he had when he was organizing his thoughts. "He's been practicing here for 9 years. Does mostly contract work, some probate. He's not a bad attorney." He put his glasses back on. "He's also on the board of the County Fair Association, which Harlan Briggs donated to last year." "I'm not drawing conclusions." "I'm not asking you to draw conclusions," Cordelia said. "I'm asking you to tell me what you know." "I know that Gerald Mott had lunch with 2 members of the county commission 3 days ago. I know because I saw them at the hotel dining room on my way to the post office." He paused. "The same 2 commissioners whose votes I mentioned to you before. The ones I'm writing up for your lawyer." She absorbed this. "He's switching from legal pressure to social pressure. That's one way to read it. What's another way?" "The same way," Gordon said, "just said differently." She thanked him and rode home. She wrote it in her notes. She sent a summary to Harriet by telegraph that afternoon. Harriet's response arrived the next morning, and it was a single line: "Don't let him make you move first." She understood. If Briggs was shifting to community pressure, working through relationships, through the commission, through whatever local influence he could activate, he was trying to make her respond in a way that looked like panic or desperation. A sudden change in how she was operating the ranch. A public statement. an approach to the commission herself, anything that put her on the defensive in the community rather than in the courtroom. She didn't move. She kept working. She rode the north pasture every morning. She managed the cattle. She addressed the hay moisture problem in the east barn. She had a conversation with a fence supplier about spring materials that she would have had regardless of any of this. She was visible and normal and continuous because that was both the right strategy and, more than that, the truth of who she was. This was her ranch. She ran it. That didn't change because a man had filed fraudulent paperwork. Aldous Frey's full written report arrived on a Wednesday in the third week of January. Harriet sent it by express postus, which meant it was important enough that she hadn't waited for the regular mail route. The report was 14 pages. It covered both the notary affidavit and the original deed document, and it was written in the precise technical language of a man who had spent 20 years making sure that what he put on paper could survive being questioned by an attorney. The affidavit was fabricated. The ink, the paper, the notarial language format, all inconsistent with the period. Frey estimated it had been created within the past 2 years. The original deed was more complicated. It was genuinely old. The paper and ink were period consistent, dating to approximately the 1860s. But the specific text of the property description had been altered, not recently. At some point, someone had carefully removed and replaced a section of the original document, the section describing the boundary survey line, using period-appropriate materials and techniques. The alteration was not visible to the naked eye. It required examination under magnification and with comparative chemical analysis. Frey included a 3-sentence summary near the end of his report that was the plainest thing in the document. The deed is a genuine historical document that has been fraudulently altered. The notary affidavit, submitted in support of this deed, is not a genuine historical document. Together they constitute a coordinated fraud of significant deliberation and sophistication. Cordelia sat with the report for a long time. Not reading it, she'd read it, just sitting with it. Someone had gotten hold of a real document, a real deed from the 1860s, something that had been sitting in an estate file or an archive somewhere, and had altered the boundary description with enough care and skill that it took a 20-year expert with chemical analysis equipment to identify the change, and then had fabricated a notary affidavit to authenticate it, and had filed both at a county clerk's office on a day when the regular clerk was sick. This had taken planning, resources, knowledge of how historical documents were stored and how land records worked and what a county clerk's office would and wouldn't scrutinize on a given afternoon. This was not something you did on an impulse. This was something you thought about for a year or more and then executed carefully. She thought about Harriet's words from months ago. He's been laying this groundwork for over a year. She thought about the variance application from 14 months ago, the trial run. She thought about the young man who'd appeared in Red Willow asking questions about land values. The meeting Briggs had taken with the unknown man on the Tuesday stage. The timing of the original filing on the day the regular clerk was out sick. He had thought about her north pasture for a long time before he acted. And he had chosen to act when her legal situation was already complicated 2 deceased husbands. A reputation as someone who invited misfortune, a community that whispered rather than helped. He had looked at her situation and calculated that the combination of her social isolation and the scale of the legal fight would make her likely to fold before it got expensive. He had been wrong about her, but she was aware, sitting at her table with Frey's report in her hands, that he hadn't been unreasonable in his calculation. A year ago, before Harriet and before John Edner and before Gordon Albright's change of conscience, before Ephraim and Tobin, she might have settled rather than fight this long. She wouldn't have wanted to, but wanting and doing were not always the same thing when you were doing them alone. She put the report in her document stack. She went to the window. Outside, it was snowing lightly, the kind of snow that added up slowly all day and then surprised you by evening with how much it had accumulated. She put on her coat and went out to check the cattle. Harriet filed a motion to present Frey's full report to Judge Thatcher the following Monday. The motion asked for an emergency hearing, not a preliminary hearing, an emergency hearing, the kind that Thatcher could call within days rather than weeks if he determined the situation warranted it. He determined it warranted it. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. On Tuesday evening, 2 days before the hearing, Ephraim came. Not with Firewood. Just riding, which he didn't usually do in the evening without a purpose. He tied his horse at her gate and knocked on the door and came in when she answered. And he had the look of someone who had something to say and had been trying to figure out the right way to say it for long enough that he'd decided the right way was just to say it. He sat at the kitchen table. She sat across from him. May had gone home an hour ago. I heard about the report, he said. Harriet sent me a summary. She thought I should know. She's thorough. She is. He looked at the table. A real deed that somebody altered. Not just a fake document. They found a real one and changed it. Yes. That's not something a person does casually. No. He was quiet for a moment. How long do you think he was planning this? At least a year. Probably longer. She said it plainly. He picked me specifically. He picked the timing. He picked the day the regular clerk was sick. He did his research. Ephraim looked up at her. He picked you because he thought you'd be easier to pressure than someone with more people around them. Yes, the word sat between them for a moment. He was wrong, Ephraim said. He was. She met his eyes, partly because of you. And Tobin. And Harriet and Gordon and John Edner. But I want to be clear, I didn't fight this because I had help. I fought it because it was right. The help made it possible to sustain. I know the difference, he said. I'm not trying to claim credit. I know you're not. He put his hands flat on the table. He had calloused hands, the permanent kind that come from years of work rather than a recent season of it, and there was a scar along his left thumb that he'd mentioned once in passing as the result of a fence wire mishap 3 winters back. There's something I want to say, he said. And I want to say it now, before Thursday. Because after Thursday, things are going to go one way or another, and I don't want to have not said it. She waited. I came to this county with Tobin and a wagon load of debt and a piece of land that's better than nothing, but not by a wide margin. I didn't come here looking for anything beyond rebuilding what I'd lost. He paused. But somewhere in the past several months, I started thinking about things I wasn't thinking about when I arrived. About what this county looks like in 10 years. About the corridor between our properties. About the orchard. He stopped. About you. She didn't look away. I'm not saying this because the case is almost over, and I think the timing is romantic, he said in the direct way he had, of addressing the thing most people would dance around. I'm saying it because I've been sitting on it for 2 months, and sitting on it is starting to feel dishonest, which I don't like. What are you saying exactly, she said. I'm saying I'd like to know if what I'm feeling is one-sided, he said. That's all. I'm not asking for anything. I just want to know if it's one-sided. She looked at him for a moment. At the calloused hands and the frayed collar and the scar on his thumb and the face that showed what it was thinking, whether it had permission or not. It isn't, she said. He let out a breath that he'd been holding, she realized, since he sat down. Okay, he said. That's all you're going to say. For tonight, yes. He looked at her. You've got a court hearing in 2 days, and I've got a cattle rotation to sort out tomorrow, and Tobin is going to come home from school at 4 o'clock and ask me what you said about the case, and I'm going to have to answer him. He paused. There's time to say more things later. She almost laughed. Not because it was absurd, but because it was so thoroughly impractical and honest, and not interested in performing a moment that could be lived instead. There is, she said. Time later. He stayed another half hour. They talked about the cattle rotation and the orchard and the East Barnes hay situation, and the conversation was completely ordinary and also not ordinary at all. And when he left, she stood on the porch in the cold and watched his lantern move down the road, same as she had done on the first night he'd come by, except that this time was different in every way that mattered. The Thursday hearing was not long. Harriet presented Aldous Frey's full report, submitted into evidence. She presented the preliminary hearing record, the injunction, the Lockridge statement, the Gordon Albright statement, John Edner's field notes, both sets. She presented the settlement letter with Cordelia's annotation. She presented the pattern documentation from the county records. She presented the brokerage connection. She laid it out in order, each piece following the last, the same way she had been building it since November, except that now the foundation was solid enough that the whole structure was visible. Gerald Mott, Briggs's new attorney, made 3 objections. Thatcher overruled all 3. Mott's arguments were competent, but they were responding to the wrong case. He was arguing the deed's authenticity when Frey's report had already moved the question past authenticity into the territory of documented fraud. He hadn't had enough time with the case to understand what kind of fight it had become. Thatcher called a brief recess. 20 minutes. Cordelia sat in the hallway with Harriet, who was reviewing her notes with the focused stillness she had in the moments right before a decision. "How does it feel?" Cordelia said. Harriet looked up. She considered the question with the seriousness she gave most things. "It feels like we've done what we can do, which is either enough or it isn't. That's not comforting." "No," Harriet agreed, "but it's honest." When Thatcher came back, he sat down and looked at both tables. Harlan Briggs was at the other table, and for the first time in all of this, he looked different than he had at the preliminary hearing. Not worried, exactly, but recalibrated, the way he'd been briefly in the courthouse hallway when Cordelia had answered him in a way he hadn't expected. The smile was present but thinner. Thatcher spoke for 11 minutes. Cordelia counted without meaning to. He reviewed the evidentiary record. He noted the document examiner's findings on both the affidavit and the deed. He noted that the affidavit had been submitted to this court as authentic evidence and had been determined by a qualified expert to be fabricated. He noted that this determination, standing alone, was sufficient grounds for dismissal of the original claim. He went on to say that the additional pattern evidence presented by the respondent, the brokerage connection, the commission meeting documentation, the unauthorized surveying conduct constituted a record that this court felt obligated to preserve in its entirety, and that he was referring the matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review of potential fraud. Referral. Not just dismissal, referral. Cordelia heard the word and felt something shift in her chest that took a moment to identify. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was the feeling of a weight that you've been carrying for so long that you've stopped noticing since its constant presence becoming suddenly, strikingly absent. The claim filed by Harlan Briggs against the North Pasture parcel of the Wexford property is dismissed with prejudice, Thatcher said. The temporary injunction is dissolved as moot. Court costs are assessed to the claimant. He banged his gavel. The room moved. Cordelia sat for a moment without getting up. Harriet was writing something in her notes with the focused attention of someone capturing the exact wording for the record. Around them, people stood, shuffled, collected coats. Across the room, Gerald Mott was speaking quietly to Harlan Briggs. Briggs was listening. His face was controlled, but the smile was gone entirely, and what replaced it was not distress or anger, but the blank, processing expression of someone calculating the next move in a situation that had just changed shape. He did not look at Cordelia on the way out. She stood up. Harriet stood beside her, put her papers in her bag. "Dismissed with prejudice," Cordelia said. "With prejudice. He can't refile the same claim." Harriet glanced at her. "And the referral matters. The Attorney General's office may or may not act on it, but it's in the public record now. It follows him. It follows him everywhere he tries to do this again." Yes. They walked out into the January cold. The sky was the flat white of a day that might produce snow or might just hold the threat of it all afternoon. The street was quiet, a few people moving on errands, the ordinary life of a county seat going forward. Cordelia stood outside the courthouse and breathed in the cold air. She was not a woman who cried easily or publicly, and she didn't cry now. But she stood there for a moment and let herself feel it, the full weight of what had just happened, and what it meant, and what it had cost to get here. The North Pasture was hers. It had always been hers. But now the record was clear in a way it hadn't been for 3 months. And clear records mattered. And the man who had tried to take it was going to have his name attached to a fraud referral in every county where anyone thought to look. Harriet said something that Cordelia missed. "I'm sorry," she said. "I said you did this," Harriet said. Not with sentiment, but with the precision she used for statements she meant specifically. "You found the discrepancies in the filing. You documented the stakes. You identified Gordon Albright as a resource before I even knew he existed. You wrote down everything, every date, every conversation, every detail. I brought the legal framework. You built the case." Cordelia looked at her. "We built it," Harriet almost smiled. For her, almost was considerably more than most people managed. "We built it," she agreed. They parted at the street corner, Harriet back to the hotel to pack and catch the afternoon stage to Helena, Cordelia to her horse and the ride home. She rode back to the ranch in the flat white January light, and the road was familiar under her horse's hooves, the same road she'd ridden since the first morning she'd owned this property, and the land on either side of it was hers, had been hers, would remain hers. And the document that said so was now backed by a court record that said so too, and the man had tried to argue otherwise was going to carry that argument in the public record for the rest of his time in this territory. She unsaddled her horse at the barn. Denny came out to take the tack and looked at her face and read it correctly and said, "Good news, then." And she said, "Yes," and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. She went inside. May was there, she'd come early, she said, in case, and there was something in the oven, and the kitchen was warm. Cordelia took her coat off and sat down at the table where she'd spread every document and written every note and drunk more coffee than was probably good for her over the course of the last 3 months. And she put her hands flat on the surface and felt the grain of the wood under her palms. May set a cup of coffee in front of her. Then she sat down too, and she didn't say anything, and Cordelia didn't say anything, and the kitchen was warm and quiet, and that was exactly what it needed to be. An hour later, she heard hooves on her road. She looked out the window. Ephraim and Tobin, riding side by side. No wagon, just the 2 horses, moving at a pace that suggested they'd heard something and come straight from wherever they were when they heard it. She went to the door. Tobin was off his horse before it fully stopped, which was a habit she'd noted before, and which Ephraim consistently and unsuccessfully tried to discourage. He came through the gate at a trot and stopped in front of her porch, with his hat knocked sideways from the ride and his face asking the question before his mouth did. "Did you win?" he said. "Dismissed with prejudice," she said. "That means he can't try the same thing again." He looked at her for a moment, processing this with the seriousness he brought to things that mattered. Then he said, "Good," with the complete simplicity of someone for whom the outcome was always inevitable because the alternative was unacceptable, and that was the whole of his reaction. And she found it more sustaining than any elaborate celebration could have been. Ephraim came through the gate at a more measured pace. He looked at her. She nodded once. He let out a breath. "Come inside," she said. May made something. They went inside. All of them Tobin, interrogating May immediately about what was in the oven. Ephraim setting his hat on the peg by the door, the way he'd started doing without being asked. Some point in the past several weeks. Cordelia moving to help with the cups and not minding for once that the kitchen was crowded. The snow that had been threatening all afternoon finally arrived as they were eating, coming down steady and soft outside the window, the kind of snow that covered things evenly and made the world quieter and would be beautiful in the morning when the light came back. Inside, the kitchen was warm. The conversation was ordinary. Tobin had arithmetic to discuss, the perpetual grievance of a 9-year-old who was usually right and knew it. Ephraim had a question about the orchard timing that led to a 20-minute conversation about what root stock worked in this soil and this climate. May refilled cups without being asked, and the snow came down outside, and the case was over, and the north pasture was secure, and the kitchen table that had been covered in documents for 3 months was covered instead in plates and cups, and the comfortable disorder of people who were at ease with each other. This was what winning looked like, Cordelia thought. Not in the courtroom, there was no version of a courtroom that looked like this. This was what it looked like on the other side, when the fight was done and the thing you'd fought for was still there and still yours, and the people who'd stood beside you were sitting at your table eating May's cooking in a January snowstorm. She looked at Ephraim across the table. He was listening to something Tobin was saying, with his usual expression of patient attention, and then he looked up and caught her looking at him, and something passed between them that was complete, without requiring words, the particular understanding of 2 people who have agreed, in the quiet way that matters, that there is more to come. She picked up her coffee. She looked out the window at the snow. The north pasture was out there, under that snow, exactly where it had always been. The snow that had fallen, that January evening, stayed on the ground for 3 weeks. Not the dramatic, paralyzing kind of winter that shut operations down and gave you no choice but to wait it out, the slow, stubborn kind that accumulated in layers and made every task take 30% longer than it should, and reminded you that Montana winters didn't care about your schedule or your court victories or anything else you considered significant. Cordelia worked through it the same way she worked through everything. Methodically, early, without complaint, because complaint was a use of energy that didn't return anything useful. But something was different in those 3 weeks, and she knew it, and she didn't try to convince herself otherwise. The difference was not dramatic. It wasn't the kind of change you could point to and say, here, on this day, everything shifted. It was more like the way light changes in a room when someone opens a window you'd forgotten was there. Same room, more air. Ephraim came twice that first week. Not with Firewood, the roads were difficult enough that the wagon was impractical, but on horseback. For reasons that were always practical and adjacent to the case, or the ranch, or something that needed doing, and Cordelia noted this without comment because she recognized it for what it was. He was working his way toward something, and he was doing it in the only language he appeared to be fluent in, which was the language of showing up and being useful, and letting the time do what time does. She let him. She was not a woman who needed to be courted with words. She'd had words with 2 husbands, and she understood both their value and their limitations. What she paid attention to was what people did when they weren't performing, and what Ephraim did when he wasn't performing was fix things. He'd noticed the gate hinge was stiff in the cold and had brought a can of grease and done something about it without announcing it. He'd noticed the East Barn's moisture problem she'd mentioned once in passing and had asked John Edner about drainage options, which Edner had mentioned to Cordelia, which was how she found out about it. He did these things without keeping a ledger. That was the part that mattered. Tobin, for his part, had moved through the post-hearing period with the equanimity of someone who had known the outcome would be acceptable and was now ready to focus on more interesting problems. The primary one being whether his pony could be persuaded to cross the creek behind his father's property without stopping at the bank and refusing. He reported on this project to Cordelia with the same detailed regularity he'd once applied to the arithmetic dispute, and she listened with the same genuine interest, because the pony's resistance to water was an actual problem with an actual solution, and Tobin approached it with the systematic attention of someone who would eventually figure it out. In the second week of February, a letter arrived from the Territorial Attorney General's office. It was addressed to Cordelia, but also in a CC notation at the bottom to Judge Thatcher. It confirmed receipt of the court's referral and stated that an investigation into the conduct described in the case record had been opened. It did not describe what that investigation would entail or what its timeline would be. It was the kind of letter that government offices write when they want to acknowledge something without committing to anything specific, and Cordelia read it twice and filed it in her document stack. She sent a copy to Harriet. Harriet's response came a week later, and it was characteristically spare. This is the best outcome you could have hoped for from the referral. It means the record is active, not shelved. Whatever he tries next, this follows him. She thought about Harlan Briggs reading that same letter because he would have received notification of the investigation, or his attorney would have, and he would know that his name was now attached to an active file in the Attorney General's office. She thought about what that meant for a man whose entire method depended on operating in the spaces between official attention, on using legal mechanisms in ways that looked routine until someone looked closely enough to see they weren't. She found she didn't think about him with anger anymore. She had spent a lot of the past 3 months being angry, which was justified and useful in the way that anger sometimes is. It had kept her moving when the exhaustion and the uncertainty might have otherwise slowed her down. But the anger had done its work, and she'd set it down somewhere along the way, and what was left in its place was something more like clear-eyed awareness of the kind of person he was, and the kind of person she was, and the distance between those two things. She did not hope he suffered. She hoped, specifically and practically, that the Attorney General's investigation found enough to his particular approach to acquiring land impossible to continue. That was all. The rest of it she left alone. In early March, the ground began to soften. The particular kind of softening that meant spring was a real thing, rather than a theoretical one. You could feel it in the mud at the barn door and in the way the cattle moved differently, with less of the conserving energy stillness of deep winter and more of the restless anticipation of animals who knew grass was coming. Cordelia started on the orchard. She hadn't planned to start so early. She'd thought April, when the ground was reliably workable and the frost risk was past. But she went out one morning to check the east section and found herself standing among the old apple trees, with her hands in the pockets of her coat, looking at what 12 years of neglect had done and what it hadn't done, and the assessment was not as bad as she'd feared. The trees were old and unpruned, and several had dead sections that needed to come out. But the rootstock was still viable. She could tell by the new growth at the base of the damaged sections, small green shoots with the particular insistence of something alive that intends to keep being alive. The orchard wasn't dead. It was neglected, which was a different problem, and one that had a solution. She started clearing the dead wood that same afternoon. Ephraim appeared 2 days later, which she hadn't arranged and hadn't expected, arriving at the east section fence line with a pruning saw and the information that he'd spoken to a nursery in Helena about compatible grafting stock. He didn't ask if he could help. He climbed the fence and started on the nearest tree. She looked at him for a moment. "You called Helena," she said. "Wrote, actually. Couple weeks ago." He worked the saw through a dead branch with the efficiency of someone who knew what he was doing. "They have northern hardy stock that matches what's already here. It can ship by late April if we want it. You ordered it already." I asked about availability. He glanced at her. "I didn't order anything without asking you." She picked up her own tool and started on the next tree. They worked without talking for a while, the sound of the saws and the occasional crack of dead wood coming down, filling the space between them in a way that was comfortable, in the particular way that shared work is comfortable to people. Doing a thing together without needing to narrate it. "My first husband planted these," she said after a while. "I know. You mentioned it. He wasn't a particularly good farmer. He was a better rancher than a farmer. But he wanted an orchard, and he put these in himself, and they were doing well by the time he died." She took a breath. "I stopped coming out here after. I told myself I was too busy, and I was, but that wasn't the whole reason." Ephraim didn't say anything. He kept working, which was the right response. "I think I'm done not coming out here," she said. "Seems like it," he said. They worked until the light went flat and gray, and by the time they stopped, 8 trees had been pruned and the dead sections cleared, and the orchard looked like a place where something was happening, rather than a place where something had stopped. Ephraim sat on the fence rail to rest. She stood near him, both of them looking at the work. "I want to talk about the corridor," she said. He looked at her. "All right. Not as a legal matter. As a practical one." She had thought about how to say this clearly without it sound like something else, and had concluded that sounding like something else was probably unavoidable, and she should just say it. "The creek access along the shared boundary is valuable to both our operations. Right now it's undermanaged, which wastes the resource. A formal grazing agreement, written, registered, fair to both sides, would benefit both properties, and would also make the boundary line a matter of record, in a way that makes it harder for anyone to claim ambiguity about it in the future." He nodded slowly. "You're talking about protecting both properties by tying them together officially." "Yes. And about not wasting good land, because neither of us has gotten around to using it properly. What would the terms look like?" "I've been thinking about that. Your herd is larger than my grazing capacity on the west section right now. I've got unused pasture. A seasonal grazing arrangement, where you have access to my west section, in exchange for shared maintenance of the creek corridor and the shared fence line, puts both of us on the record as cooperative parties, with a legitimate mutual interest in that boundary." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a very practical way to describe something that also happens to be good for both of us." "I'm a practical person, I know." He said it without irony. "I've noticed." She looked at him. "If the terms are fair, will you do it?" "Yes," he said it simply. "I'll have a lawyer look at it, not Mott, somebody else, and if the terms are fair, yes." "Good." He was still on the fence rail, and the light was going, and the orchard was quiet around them, and she was aware of the particular quality of the moment, in the way that you are aware of some moments even while they're happening, not dramatically, not with any sense of ceremony, just the quiet knowing that something real is occurring. "Ephraim," she said, "yes, I've been alone for a long time. Not just without a husband alone in the specific way where you stop expecting people to stay." She said it with the directness she used for things that mattered and that she'd thought about carefully. "I'm not good at letting people stay. I don't know if that changes." He looked at her with the full attention he brought to things that required it. "I've been alone too," he said. "Different kind. I had Tobin, which means I was never lonely in the practical sense." But he stopped. "There's a particular kind of alone that doesn't have anything to do with whether someone else is present." "Yes, I know that kind." He shifted on the fence rail. "I'm not asking you to be easy about it. I'm not asking you to pretend the alone goes away. I'm just—" He stopped again, and there was something almost wry in his expression. The expression of a man who is aware that he is saying something imperfectly and has decided that saying it imperfectly is better than not saying it. "I'm just here. That's the whole of it. I'm here, and I intend to keep being here, and if that becomes something, then it becomes something." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very practical way to describe something that also happens to matter," she said. He smiled. The real kind, not the careful kind people produce in rooms where they're being watched, but the kind that arrives without strategy. I learned it from someone, he said. She almost smiled back. Come inside. There's supper. They walked back across the east section in the early dark, and the orchard was behind them with its pruned trees and its small green shoots at the base of the damaged sections, alive and intent on continuing, and ahead of them the lights of the house were visible through the March cold, warm and specific and real. The grazing agreement was drawn up in April by an attorney in the county seat, whom neither of them had worked with before, a careful, methodical woman named Clara Hensley, who asked good questions and wrote clean contracts and charged a fair rate and didn't seem to know or particularly care about the Briggs case, which was the most useful quality she had. Ephraim's attorney reviewed it. Cordelia reviewed it herself, clause by clause, because she was going to keep reading documents carefully for the rest of her life, and she'd accepted that about herself. They signed it on a Tuesday afternoon and registered it at the county clerk's office, where Gordon Albright witnessed the registration with the expression of a man who was quietly satisfied about something. He stamped the registration with the particular deliberateness of someone who understood that this specific piece of paper going into the official record was not a routine event. This is good for both operations, he said, which was all he said and all he needed to. That same April, the first of the orchard grafts went in. Ephraim had been right about the Helena nursery. The stock arrived in good condition, hardy and appropriate for the climate, and they spent 3 days planting, with May bringing out lunch both days in Tobin on the Saturday, helping in the particular way that a 10-year-old helps, which is to say enthusiastically and not always accurately, but with enough genuine effort that the net result was positive. Tobin had turned 10 in March. Cordelia had made him a pie, which he'd eaten a third of at one sitting and had described afterward as possibly the best thing he'd ever had, which May found personally meaningful, given that May had contributed significantly to the construction of the pie and had not been given credit in Tobin's review. He said possibly, May pointed out. He said best thing, Cordelia said. He said possibly the best thing. There's a difference. He's 10. He's being diplomatic. May considered this. For 10, that's actually impressive. The orchard project took most of the spring. It was not the dramatic kind of work that looked like progress from the outside. It was the slow, patient kind that mostly looked like two people moving between trees with tools, making decisions about what needed to go and what needed encouragement and what needed to be left alone to do what it was going to do at its own pace. But by the end of April, the section had the quality of a place with a future rather than a place with only a past. And Cordelia would go out in the evening sometimes and stand among the trees and think about what it would look like in 5 years, in 10, when the grafts had taken and the pruned trees had had seasons to recover and the whole section was productive again. She never thought about it with sadness for the years it had been neglected. She'd made her peace with that. You don't get the years back, and you don't need to, because what you're building is for the years ahead. In May, word came through Harriet that the Territorial Attorney General's investigation into Harlan Briggs had resulted in a formal finding. The finding documented 3 instances of fraudulent land, claims the one against Cordelia, the earlier Devlin case that had settled, and a third case in another county that Cordelia hadn't known about. The finding was entered into the public record, and Briggs was barred from filing land claims in Montana Territory for a period of 10 years. He was not imprisoned. Harriet had been honest about the limits of what the investigation could accomplish, and criminal prosecution for land fraud was difficult in the territory without clearer statutory support than currently existed. But the bar was real, and it was public, and it meant that anyone who wanted to could look up Harlan Briggs's name and find, attached to it, a formal finding of fraudulent conduct. Cordelia read the notice and thought about the Devlin case. 40 acres, a sick wife, a man who had been tired enough and isolated enough that he'd settled rather than fight. She thought about what it would have cost that man and his wife, and she thought about the difference between his situation and hers. And the difference came down to exactly what she'd understood it to come down to all along. He had been alone with it. She hadn't been. She wrote to Harriet. She wrote a longer letter than she usually wrote, and she said things she didn't normally say in professional correspondence. She thanked Harriet not just for the legal work, but for the way she'd done it for treating the case as a fraud that needed to be proven, rather than a dispute that needed to be managed, for pushing the referral even when the dismissal alone would have been sufficient. for being the kind of attorney who saw the full picture and worked the whole picture, rather than just the part she was getting paid for. Harriet wrote back in her characteristically brief fashion, but the last line of the letter was unusual for her. It said, "You built a case that was worth winning, that matters more than the outcome." Cordelia folded the letter and put it in the document stack, which she'd kept intact because she wasn't ready to disperse it and wasn't sure she ever would be. It was a record. Records mattered. She'd learned that more thoroughly in the past 8 months than in all the years before them. The grazing arrangement proved itself over the summer. Ephraim's cattle rotated through the west section on a schedule that both operations could plan around, and the creek corridor properly maintained now, with the fence line registered and the shared responsibility documented, became what it had always had the potential to be. The grass was managed rather than sporadically grazed. The creek banks were in better shape by August than they'd been in years. The arrangement was, by any practical measure, good for both properties. And it was, by any honest accounting, good for the people involved in it. There's a particular quality to a collaboration that is genuinely equal, where both parties are putting in and both parties are getting back, and neither one is doing the other a favor, exactly. But both are doing each other the favor of taking each other seriously as capable people with legitimate interests. That quality is rarer than it should be, and when you find it, you recognize it by the way it doesn't require either party to diminish themselves to make it work. Cordelia recognized it clearly. In September, Ephraim asked if she'd marry him. He did it on a Tuesday, which was not a romantic day by any convention, but which was, as she thought about it afterward, completely appropriate. It was a working day. They were in the corridor, checking the fence line after a cattle rotation, and he said it the way he said most important things directly, without ornamentation, looking at her rather than at some middle distance between them. "I want to marry you," he said, "not because of the land or the grazing agreement, or because it makes practical sense, though it does make practical sense. Because you are the most capable and honest person I've met in this county, and because I want to spend the next 30 years of my life with someone I respect as much as I respect you. And because Tobin loves you, which matters to me but is not the primary reason. Just to be clear about the order." She looked at him. He had grass stains on his coat from where he'd knelt to check a fence post. He was squinting slightly because the September sun was directly behind her. He had that expression on his face, the one that showed what he was thinking, whether he gave it permission or not. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. "Good. That's all." "What else is there to say?" "Nothing," she agreed. "Nothing else at all." They got married in October, small and practical, because neither of them was interested in performing anything for an audience. May was there. Gordon Albright came, which surprised Cordelia more than she expected, and moved her more than she showed. John Edner came with his wife, a quiet woman named Ruth, who shook Cordelia's hand with both of hers, and said she was glad for her, and meant it. Harriet Voss sent a letter because she couldn't make the distance from Helena, and the letter was 2 sentences long and said everything it needed to. Tobin wore his good shirt and sat in the front row and watched the proceedings with the serious attention he brought to things he considered significant. Afterward, at the table, May had made enough food for 3 times the number of people present, which was characteristic. He sat beside Cordelia and worked his way through a plate of food and then looked at her with the inventory expression. "Does this mean you're my mother now?" he said. The table went quiet. Cordelia looked at him. He wasn't performing the question, he was asking it the way he asked most things, because it was in his head and it seemed relevant, and he wanted to know the answer. "It means I'm in your life in a way that lasts," she said carefully. "What that means to you, what word you use for it, is yours to decide. I'm not going to tell you what to call it." He thought about this with his usual seriousness. "Okay," he said. "And then can I have more pie?" "You can have more pie," May said, already moving. Ephraim looked at Cordelia across the table. She looked at him. There was nothing that needed to be said, and they were both aware of that, and they let it be. What Cordelia understood, living through that first year of marriage, and then the ones that followed, was that none of it was simple. She had not married a simple man, and she was not a simple woman, and they were not a simple family, and the ranch they built together was not a simple operation. There were arguments not the dramatic kind, but the real kind, about decisions and resources and priorities, and whose judgment was right in which situation, and sometimes one of them was wrong and had to admit it, and sometimes the situation was genuinely unclear, and they had to live with the uncertainty together, which was harder. Ephraim had habits that irritated her. She had habits that irritated him. Tobin went through a period at 11 of testing every boundary in reach, which was both developmentally normal and practically exhausting, and they navigated it the way they navigated most things, imperfectly, with honesty about the imperfection, and with the steady intention to keep trying. But the corridor was managed. The orchard came into productive years. The north pasture was fully operational, the grass coming up thick every April, the cattle cycling through it on a schedule that made the land richer rather than poorer. The grazing agreement held, and when they revisited its terms in the second year to adjust for the expansion of the herd, they revised it fairly and registered the revision, because that was how they operated on the record, clearly, with documents that said exactly what the arrangement was. Harlan Briggs left Red Willow County 2 years after the court finding. Cordelia heard about it from May, who had heard it from the butcher's wife, who still seemed to have access to information about everything. He went south, to another territory, and whatever he did there, Cordelia didn't hear about and didn't pursue. He was not her problem anymore. The record had made him not her problem, which was all she had wanted the record to do. Gordon Albright retired from the county clerk's office after 17 more years of service. At his retirement, he gave a short speech at the community hall that was mostly practical and slightly emotional in the way that practical men's speeches sometimes are when they finally let themselves think about what their work meant. He said that the most important thing about a land record is not that it's official, it's that it's accurate. An official record that isn't accurate is a weapon. An accurate record one that reflects what actually happened and who actually owns what is a form of protection that benefits everyone in the community, not just the people with the resources to fight for their rights. Cordelia was in the room when he said it. She thought about a November morning 3 years earlier when she'd stood at his counter and said, "Show me the filing." And he'd laid the folder on the counter and told her, off the record, that he didn't recognize the deed. Sometimes people act with more courage than they know they're going to, and you don't realize until afterward that the moment you're thinking about was one of those times. Tobin grew up between the two properties until there was no real distinction between them in his mind or in practice. He was a rancher by the time he was 15, genuinely and usefully, not in the way children are called ranchers to be encouraging, but in the way that a person who has been paying attention to land and cattle and weather and fencing since before they could reliably make coffee begins to have real instincts about it, real knowledge, the kind that comes from watching carefully over time. He understood the corridor. He understood what the north pasture was and why it was valuable and what had been attempted against it. He'd been part of that story since he was 9 years old, and he carried it not as a burden but as context, the understanding that things that are worth having sometimes require the willingness to fight for them in the specific way that they need to be fought for, not the dramatic way, not the loudest way, but the careful and documented and sustained way. He also eventually learned to get his pony across the creek. It took 2 years, which Cordelia maintained was a reflection of the pony's character rather than Tobin's training ability, and which Ephraim maintained was not relevant now that the pony had been replaced by a horse, and which Tobin said was beside the point because the principle was the same. The principle, as he explained it, was that you don't force things across obstacles they're afraid of. You stand with them at the bank long enough that the obstacle becomes familiar, and then one day they cross it themselves, and you let them think it was their idea. Cordelia, when she heard this, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who taught you that?" He looked at her with the expression she'd first seen on him at 9 years old, the serious inventorying look that weighed things before it decided on them. "I think I learned it from watching you," he said. She didn't have anything to say to that. She wasn't sure anything needed to be said. What she understood by that point in her life was that the most important things rarely look the way you expect them to when they arrive. A battered wagon on a snowy road at midnight, a child with a single piece of firewood, a letter from an attorney in Helena, a 9-year-old boy with a hand-drawn map and the good sense not to touch what he'd found. None of these looked like turning points. They looked like ordinary things, small things, the kind of things that happen every day on ranches and in counties and in lives without announcing their own significance. But they were turning points, each of them, and what made them turning points was not the things themselves, but the people involved in them. People who paid attention, who acted with honesty, even when it was inconvenient, who showed up without keeping a ledger of what they were owed for showing up. Cordelia had spent the years before all of this believing that her wealth was the most defended thing she owned. She'd built fences around it.
Legal and practical and social, because wealth attracted the kind of attention that wanted to take rather than to give, and she'd learned that early and learned it thoroughly.
What she understood afterward was that the fences she'd built around herself, the careful distance, the refusal to let people close enough to be lost, those had been protecting something too. But what they'd been protecting wasn't wealth. It was the part of her that was capable of being hurt. The trouble with that kind of protection is that it works too well. It keeps the hurt out and the warmth out in the same motion, and after enough years, you stop noticing that the warmth is gone, because you've convinced yourself you don't need it. She had needed it. She just hadn't known how to stop protecting against it long enough to let it in. It had taken a child with a single piece of firewood to get the gate open. And then the gate had stayed open, and the things that came through it, the fight, the fear, the sustained work of not being defeated, and then the orchard and the corridor and the marriage and the family assembled from pieces that didn't originally belong together. All of those things had come through the same gate. That was the thing about walls, she thought. In the particular way she thought about it when she was out in the north pasture in the early morning, with the light just coming up and the grass thick under the frost, and the whole ranch visible, and hers and real. Walls keep things out, which is sometimes necessary. But a gate is different from a wall. A gate can be opened. And sometimes the most important choice you make is not whether to build the gate, but whether to unlock it when someone is standing on the other side in the dark, with a wagon load of pine and a child who won't stop talking. She had unlocked it. She hadn't known what she was letting in when she did. That was probably the only way it could have happened. If she'd known, she'd have thought about it too long. And thinking too long was its own kind of wall. Every November, without fail, Ephraim and Tobin loaded a wagon with split pine. They drove it around the long way, the way they'd come that first midnight in November years ago. And they brought the season's first cord to the house and stacked it along the east wall. They'd done it the first November after the wedding as a kind of private joke, a reference to where it had started. And then they'd done it the second year, and the third. By the fourth year, it was ritual rather than joke, and rituals, Cordelia had learned, are how families tell themselves what they are. Tobin always brought the first piece himself. He was nearly grown now, taller than his father, with the same honest face and the same habit of showing what he was thinking, whether he'd given it permission or not. He carried the first log up to the porch and set it there, and it was a small thing, a piece of firewood, and it was also every piece of firewood that had come before it and the story they all attached to. One year Tobin was 16, he set the log down and looked at Cordelia with the expression he'd had since he was 9. "You never needed the firewood," he said. "Did you?" "No," she said. "I had plenty of wood." "Then what did you need?" She looked at him, at this boy who had appeared at her gate at 9 years old, with a single piece of pine and the complete unself-conscious belief that what he was doing was right because it was right, and who had become this young man who asked the right questions at the right times. "The same thing everyone needs," she said. "Someone to bring warmth to the door without asking what they're going to get for it." He thought about this. "That's why we still do it." "That's why," she said. He picked up more wood and started stacking. Ephraim came up behind him. The cold November morning was doing what November mornings did in Montana, making the breath visible, and the sky flat and white, and the ground hard, and the work of staying warm a real and daily thing, rather than an abstraction. Inside, May's kitchen sounds were already audible through the wall. Inside was warm. Inside was full of the specific and irreplaceable noise of a life that had people in it. Cordelia stood on the porch and watched her family work. And she felt the weight of everything it had taken to arrive at this particular morning, the fights and the documents and the fear and the sustained, unglamorous effort of not giving up. And she let herself feel it without pushing it away, because you should feel the things you've earned, even when they're complicated, especially when they're complicated. The north pasture stretched out beyond the fence, frostbright and entirely hers. The gate was open. It had been open for years.